Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
Years a Slave getting rave reviews, and as you can see from some of these images, boy, they will stay with you. Very uncomfortable to watch. The kidnapped free man looking out of the bars of his slave pen and seeing our Temple of Freedom, the Capitol Dome.
And Bruce Leshan wondered if that part of the movie was real and whether he could locate that pen.
I was born a free man, lived with my family in New York.
We're good for your money.
Until the day I was deceived.
To Solomon.
Kidnapped. Sold into slavery.
More than a dozen years after his capture, Solomon Northrup wrote...
Well, boy, how you feel now?
His imprisonment in the basement of Washington's most notorious slave pen.
Well, I don't want to survive. I want to live.
The story is true, and the Yellow House, or William's slave pen, was indeed shockingly close to the Capitol.
We are standing right near where that slave pen was.
Lonnie Bunch is director of the National Museum of African American History. Northup's prison was just across the street from Bunch's temporary office. It was where the FAA now stands, at 600 Independence Avenue Southwest. Northup wrote, "The voices of patriotic representatives boasting of freedom and equality, and the rattling of the poor slaves' chains almost commingled."
Visitors would say they're on Capitol Hill, and suddenly they'd hear the sounds, the screaming of the enslaved in the slave pens.
That juxtaposition, the slave pen here, the U.S. Capitol right over here, is no accident. Slavery was far more central to America's founding than many of us care to remember.
Slaves built the Capitol, they built the White House. So much of the streets that you walk on were once built by enslaved labor.
My name is Solomon Northrup. I'm a free man.
From D.C., Northup's captors dragged him south to Alexandria.
He came through this building, but I don't know if he was actually sold in this building.
Row after row of slave dealers once clustered on Duke Street, like used car dealers cluster together now, says a Georgetown professor. And one of the largest slave markets still stands, converted to the Freedom House Museum by the Northern Virginia Urban League.
At one time, this building was used to enslave people, and now the Northern Virginia Urban League is to empower people.
I will survive!
Remembering who we once were, says Bunch, helps us figure out who we can be. Bruce Leshan, WUSA 9.
Context of White Supremacy. Justice, Gus T Renegade, in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, November 8th, 2013. So I have been told. We will be back tomorrow for the compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Pacific. It has been so long since we have tuned in for a book session that was not Isabel Wilkerson's, The Warmth of Other Suns. I hope people got constructive information from her great book, which we wrapped up last week. Stuck to the course, July all the way through November. This book will not take anywhere near as long, but I hope that it is constructive. First study session on Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave, published in 1853, before the Civil War even. My suspicion is that many of our listeners have seen Steve McQueen's new film. That should prompt even more interest in actually reading the book and making a comparison. My hope is that also people have seen or will make an effort to see Gordon Parks' Solomon Northrup's Odyssey, which came out about 30 years ago at this point. Not the first time this book has been made into a film. It is available if you have Netflix or check online. You can view the film. Vicus, Reckless 2.0. I'd asked if I had seen that already, and I had it on my computer and was ready to roll, and just kept procrastinating and still have not made an effort to view it. But I am going to see it before this book we finish with the book. So I would encourage folks to see those two, and then, as I said, you can compare and contrast what did they leave out of the book when they went to transfer it to the big screen for both Gordon Parks' work as well as Steve McQueen's work. At any rate, a couple things I would hope that we keep in mind for the duration of this study session. Number one, why on earth are white people so focused on this book? There are two different movies of it now. Why are they focusing so much attention on this film? We've had a lot of these types of films over the past 12 months with Django Unchained. Even Lincoln would throw that in there as well. Why so much attention on slavery? Why so much attention on this particular book? I think Vicus even questioned whether or not, and some of our other listeners, is this authentic? There's some suspicion around what happened to Mr. Northrup after the book was released. It was a big seller back in the 19th century. Is this authentic? Could this be the sort of thing that white people fabricated and put out there? That's something to keep in mind. I would also say keep in mind how this quote-unquote free black male adjusts to being enslaved, and how he ends up being enslaved in the first place. Do we have another instance of white friends being our undoing? Just a few things to keep in mind as we proceed. This book is nowhere near as long as Isabel Wilkerson's book. Again, as I said, that should not impact the constructive value, but it will not take nearly as long. We will be done with this in less than 2 months. We'll probably finish this up sometime early December, so you can be having in mind books you would like to read next. We will go ahead and get started. First installment, Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave.
12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. Narrated by Sean Crisden. This unabridged audiobook was produced in the year 2012 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Such dupes are men to custom, and so prone to reverence what is ancient and can plead a course of long observance for its use, that even servitude, the worst of ills, because delivered down from sire to son, is kept and guarded as a sacred thing. But is it fit, or can it bear the shock of rational discussion that a man, compounded and made up like other men, of elements tumultuous, in whom lust and folly in as simple measure meet, as in the bosom of the slave he rules, should be a despot absolute, and boast himself the only freeman of his land? Cooper. Chapter 1. Having been born a freeman, and for more than 30 years enjoyed the blessings of liberty in a free state, and having at the end of that time been kidnapped and sold into slavery, where I remained, until happily rescued in the month of January, 1853, after a bondage of 12 years, it has been suggested that an account of my life and fortunes would not be uninteresting to the public. Since my return to liberty, I have not failed to perceive the increasing interest throughout the northern states in regard to the subject of slavery. Works of fiction professing to portray its features in their more pleasing as well as more repugnant aspects have been circulated to an extent unprecedented, and, as I understand, have created a fruitful topic of comment and discussion. I can speak of slavery only so far as it came under my own observation, only so far as I have known and experienced it in my own person. My object is to give a candid and truthful statement of facts, to repeat the story of my life without exaggeration, leaving it for others to determine whether even the pages of fiction present a picture of more cruel wrong or a severer bondage. As far back as I have been able to ascertain, my ancestors on the paternal side were slaves in Rhode Island. They belonged to a family by the name of Northup, one of whom, removing to the state of New York, settled at Hoosick, in Rensselaer County. He brought with him Mentis Northrup, my father. On the death of this gentleman, which must have occurred some 50 years ago, my father became free, having been emancipated by a direction in his will. Henry B. Northrup, Esquire, of Sandy Hill, a distinguished counselor at law, and the man to whom, under Providence, I am indebted for my present liberty, and my return to the society of my wife and children, is a relative of the family in which my forefathers were thus held to service, and from which they took the name I bear. To this fact may be attributed the persevering interest he has taken in my behalf. Some time after my father's liberation, he removed to the town of Minerva, Essex County, New York, where I was born in the month of July, 1808. How long he remained in the latter place I have not the means of definitely ascertaining. From thence he removed to Granville, Washington County, near a place known as Slyborough, where for some years he labored on the farm of Clark Northrup, also a relative of his old master. From thence he removed to the Alden farm, at Moss Street, a short distance north of the village of Sandy Hill, and from thence to the farm now owned by Russell Pratt, situated on the road leading from Fort Edward to Argyle, where he continued to reside until his death, which took place on the 22nd day of November, 1829. He left a widow and 2 children, myself and Joseph, an elder brother. The latter is still living in the county of Oswego, near the city of that name. My mother died during the period of my captivity. Though born a slave and laboring under the disadvantages to which my unfortunate race is subjected, my father was a man respected for his industry and integrity, as many now living who well remember him are ready to testify. His whole life was passed in the peaceful pursuits of agriculture, never seeking employment in those more menial positions which seem to be especially allotted to the children of Africa. Besides giving us an education surpassing that ordinarily bestowed upon children in our condition, he acquired, by his diligence and economy, a sufficient property qualification to entitle him to the right of suffrage. He was accustomed to speak to us of his early life, and although at all times cherishing the warmest emotions of kindness, and even of affection towards the family, in whose house he had been a bondsman, he nevertheless comprehended the system of slavery, and dwelt with sorrow on the degradation of his race. He endeavored to imbue our minds with sentiments of morality, and to teach us to place our trust and confidence in Him, who regards the humblest as well as the highest of His creatures. How often since that time has the recollection of his paternal counsels occurred to me, while lying in a slave hut in the distant and sickly regions of Louisiana, smarting with the undeserved wounds which an inhuman master had inflicted, and longing only for the grave which had covered him, to shield me also from the lash of the oppressor. In the churchyard at Sandy Hill, an humble stone marks the spot where he reposes, after having worthily performed the duties appertaining to the lowly sphere wherein God had appointed him to walk. Up to this period I had been principally engaged with my father in the labors of the farm. The leisure hours allowed me were generally either employed over my books or playing on the violin, an amusement which was the ruling passion of my youth. It has also been the source of consolation since, affording pleasure to the simple beings with whom my lot was cast, and beguiling my own thoughts for many hours from the painful contemplation of my fate. On Christmas Day, 1829, I was married to Anne Hampton, a colored girl then living in the vicinity of our residence. The ceremony was performed at Fort Edward by Timothy Eddy, Esquire, a magistrate of that town, and still a prominent citizen of the place. She had resided a long time at Sandy Hill, with Mr. Baird, proprietor of the Eagle Tavern, and also in the family of Reverend Alexander Proudfit of Salem. This gentleman for many years had presided over the Presbyterian Society at the latter place, and was widely distinguished for his learning and piety. Anne still holds in grateful remembrance the exceeding kindness and the excellent counsels of that good man. She is not able to determine the exact line of her descent, but the blood of 3 races mingles in her veins. It is difficult to tell whether the red, white, or black predominates. The union of them all, however, in her origin, has given her a singular but pleasing expression, such as is rarely to be seen. Though somewhat resembling, yet she cannot properly be styled a quadroon, a class to which, I have omitted to mention, my mother belonged. I had just now passed the period of my minority, having reached the age of 21 years in the month of July previous. Deprived of the advice and assistance of my father, with a wife dependent upon me for support, I resolved to enter upon a life of industry. And, notwithstanding the obstacle of color, and the consciousness of my lowly state, indulged in pleasant dreams of a good time coming, when the possession of some humble habitation with a few surrounding acres should reward my labors, and bring me the means of happiness and comfort. From the time of my marriage to this day, the love I have borne my wife has been sincere and unabated, and only those who have felt the glowing tenderness a father cherishes for his offspring can appreciate my affection for the beloved children which have since been born to us. This much I deem appropriate and necessary today, in order that those who read these pages may comprehend the poignancy of those sufferings I have been doomed to bear. Immediately upon our marriage, we commenced housekeeping in the old yellow building then standing at the southern extremity of Fort Edward village, and which has since been transformed into a modern mansion, and lately occupied by Captain Lathrop. It is known as the Fort House. In this building the courts were sometime held after the organization of the county. It was also occupied by Burgoyne in 1777, being situated near the old fort on the left bank of the Hudson. During the winter I was employed with others repairing the Champlain Canal, on that section over which William Van Nortwick was superintendent. David McEachron had the immediate charge of the men in whose company I labored. By the time the canal opened in the spring, I was enabled, from the savings of my wages, to purchase a pair of horses, and other things necessarily required in the business of navigation. Having hired several efficient hands to assist me, I entered into contracts for the transportation of large rafts of timber from Lake Champlain to Troy. Dyer Beckwith and a Mr. Bartamy of Whitehall accompanied me on several trips. During the season I became perfectly familiar with the art and mysteries of rafting, a knowledge which afterwards enabled me to render profitable service to a worthy master, and to astonish the simple-witted lumbermen on the banks of the Bayou Boeuf. In one of my voyages down Lake Champlain, I was induced to make a visit to Canada. Repairing to Montreal, I visited the cathedral and other places of interest in that city, from whence I continued my excursion to Kingston and other towns, obtaining a knowledge of localities, which was also of service to me afterwards, as will appear towards the close of this narrative. Having completed my contracts on the canal satisfactorily to myself and to my employer, and not wishing to remain idle now that the navigation of the canal was again suspended, I entered into another contract with Medad Gunn to cut a large quantity of wood. In this business I was engaged during the winter of 1831-32. With the return of spring, and in myself conceived the project of taking a farm in the neighborhood. I had been accustomed from earliest youth to agricultural labors, and it was an occupation congenial to my tastes. I accordingly entered into arrangements for a part of the old Alden farm, on which my father formerly resided. With 1 cow, 1 swine, a yoke of fine oxen I had lately purchased of Lewis Brown in Hartford, and other personal property and effects, we proceeded to our new home in Kingsbury. That year I planted 25 acres of corn, sowed large fields of oats, and commenced farming upon as large a scale as my utmost means would permit. Anne was diligent about the house affairs, while I toiled laboriously in the field. On this place we continued to reside until 1834. In the winter season I had numerous calls to play on the violin. Wherever the young people assembled to dance, I was almost invariably there. Throughout the surrounding villages my fiddle was notorious. Anne also, during her long residence at the Eagle Tavern, had become somewhat famous as a cook. During court weeks and on public occasions she was employed at high wages in the kitchen at Sherrill's Coffee House. We always returned home from the performance of these services with money in our pockets, so that with fiddling, cooking, and farming we soon found ourselves in the possession of abundance, and in fact leading a happy and prosperous life. Well indeed would it have been for us had we remained on the farm at Kingsbury, but the time came when the next step was to be taken towards the cruel destiny that awaited me. In March 1834 we removed to Saratoga Springs. We occupied a house belonging to Daniel O'Brien on the north side of Washington Street. At that time Isaac Taylor kept a large boarding house, known as Washington Hall, at the north end of Broadway. He employed me to drive a hack, in which capacity I worked for him 2 years. After this time I was generally employed through the visiting season, as also was Anne in the United States Hotel and other public houses of the place. In winter seasons I relied upon my violin, though during the construction of the Troy and Saratoga Railroad I performed many hard days' labor upon it. I was in the habit, at Saratoga, of purchasing articles necessary for my family at the stores of Mr. Cephas Parker and Mr. William Perry, gentlemen towards whom, for many acts of kindness, I entertained feelings of strong regard. It was for this reason that 12 years afterwards I caused to be directed to them the letter which is hereinafter inserted, and which was the means, in the hands of Mr. Northrup, of my fortunate deliverance. While living at the United States Hotel, I frequently met with slaves who had accompanied their masters from the South. They were always well dressed and well provided for, leading apparently an easy life, with but few of its ordinary troubles to perplex them. Many times they entered into conversation with me on the subject of slavery. Almost uniformly, I found they cherished a secret desire for liberty. Some of them expressed the most ardent anxiety to escape, and consulted me on the best method of effecting it. The fear of punishment, however, which they knew was certain to attend their recapture and return, in all cases proved sufficient to deter them from the experiment. Having all my life breathed the free air of the North, and conscious that I possessed the same feelings and affections that find a place in the white man's breast, conscious, moreover, of an intelligence equal to that of some men, at least with a fairer skin, I was too ignorant, perhaps too independent, to conceive how anyone could be content to live in the abject condition of a slave. I could not comprehend the justice of that law, or that religion, which upholds or recognizes the principle of slavery, and never once, I am proud to say, did I fail to counsel anyone who came to me to watch his opportunity and strike for freedom. I continued to reside at Saratoga until the spring of 1841. The flattering anticipations which 7 years before had seduced us from the quiet farmhouse on the east side of the Hudson had not been realized. Though always in comfortable circumstances, we had not prospered. The society and associations at that world-renowned watering place were not calculated to preserve the simple habits of industry and economy to which I had been accustomed, but, on the contrary, to substitute others in their stead, tending to shiftlessness and extravagance. At this time we were the parents of 3 children, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Alonzo. Elizabeth, the eldest, was in her 10th year. Margaret was 2 years younger, and little Alonzo had just passed his 5th birthday. They filled our house with gladness. Their young voices were music in our ears. Many an airy castle did their mother and myself build for the little innocents. When not at labor, I was always walking with them, clad in their best attire, through the streets and groves of Saratoga. Their presence was my delight, and I clasped them to my bosom with as warm and tender love as if their clouded skins had been as white as snow. Thus far the history of my life presents nothing whatever unusual, nothing but the common hopes and loves and labors of an obscure colored man making his humble progress in the world. But now I had reached a turning point in my existence, reached the threshold of unutterable wrong and sorrow and despair. Now had I approached within the shadow of the cloud into the thick darkness whereof I was soon to disappear, thenceforward to be hidden from the eyes of all my kindred, and shut out from the sweet light of liberty for many a weary year. Chapter 2. One morning, towards the latter part of the month of March, 1841, having at that time no particular business to engage my attention, I was walking about the village of Saratoga Springs, thinking to myself where I might obtain some present employment until the busy season should arrive. Anne, as was her usual custom, had gone over to Sandy Hill, a distance of some 20 miles, to take charge of the culinary department at Sherrill's Coffee House during the session of the court. Elizabeth, I think, had accompanied her. Margaret and Alonzo were with their aunt at Saratoga. On the corner of Congress Street and Broadway near the tavern, then and for aught I know to the contrary, still kept by Mr. Moon, I was met by two gentlemen of respectable appearance, both of whom were entirely unknown to me. I have the impression that they were introduced to me by some one of my acquaintances, but who I have in vain endeavored to recall, with the remark that I was an expert player on the violin. At any rate, they immediately entered into conversation on that subject, making numerous inquiries touching my proficiency in that respect. My responses being to all appearances satisfactory, they proposed to engage my services for a short period, stating, at the same time, I was just such a person as their business required. Their names, as they afterwards gave them to me, were Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton, though whether these were their true appellations I have strong reasons to doubt. The former was a man apparently 40 years of age, somewhat short and thick-set, with a countenance indicating shrewdness and intelligence. He wore a black frock coat and black hat, and said he resided either at Rochester or at Syracuse. The latter was a young man of fair complexion and light eyes, and, I should judge, had not passed the age of 25. He was tall and slender, dressed in a snuff-colored coat, with glossy hat and vest of elegant pattern. His whole apparel was in the extreme of fashion. His appearance was somewhat effeminate, but prepossessing, and there was about him an easy air that showed he had mingled in the world. They were connected, as they informed me, with a circus company, then in the city of Washington. That they were on their way thither to rejoin it, having left it for a short time to make an excursion northward, for the purpose of seeing the country, and were paying their expenses by an occasional exhibition. They also remarked that they had found much difficulty in procuring music for their entertainments, and that if I would accompany them as far as New York, they would give me $1 for each day's services, and $3 in addition for every night I played at their performances, besides sufficient to pay the expenses of my return from New York to Saratoga. I at once accepted the tempting offer, both for the reward it promised, and from a desire to visit the metropolis. They were anxious to leave immediately. Thinking my absence would be brief, I did not deem it necessary to write to Anne whither I had gone, in fact, supposing that my return, perhaps, would be as soon as hers. So taking a change of linen and my violin, I was ready to depart. The carriage was brought round, a covered one, drawn by a pair of noble bays, altogether forming an elegant establishment. Their baggage, consisting of 3 large trunks, was fastened on the rack, and mounting to the driver's seat while they took their places at the rear, I drove away from Saratoga on the road to Albany, elated with my new position, and happy as I had ever been on any day in all my life. We passed through Ballston, and striking the Ridge Road, as it is called, if my memory correctly serves me, followed it direct to Albany. We reached that city before dark, and stopped at a hotel southward from the museum. This night I had an opportunity of witnessing one of their performances, the only one during the whole period I was with them. Hamilton was stationed at the door. I formed the orchestra, while Brown provided the entertainment. It consisted in throwing balls, dancing on the rope, frying pancakes in a hat, causing invisible pigs to squeal, and other like feats of ventriloquism and legerdemain. The audience was extraordinarily sparse, and not of the selectest character at that, and Hamilton's report of the proceeds but a beggarly account of empty boxes. Early next morning we renewed our journey. The burden of their conversation now was the expression of an anxiety to reach the circus without delay. They hurried forward, without again stopping to exhibit, and in due course of time we reached New York, taking lodgings at a house on the west side of the city, in a street running from Broadway to the river. I supposed my journey was at an end, and expected in a day or two at least to return to my friends and family at Saratoga. Brown and Hamilton, however, began to importune me to continue with them to Washington. They alleged that immediately on their arrival, now that the summer season was approaching, the circus would set out for the north. They promised me a situation and high wages if I would accompany them. Largely did they expatiate on the advantages that would result to me, and such were the flattering representations they made that I finally concluded to accept the offer. The next morning they suggested that, inasmuch as we were about entering a slave state, it would be well, before leaving New York, to procure free papers. The idea struck me as a prudent one, though I think it would scarcely have occurred to me had they not proposed it. We proceeded at once to what I understood to be the custom house. They made oath to certain facts showing I was a free man. A paper was drawn up and handed us, with the direction to take it to the clerk's office. We did so, and the clerk, having added something to it, for which he was paid 6 shillings, we returned again to the custom house. Some further formalities were gone through with before it was completed, when, paying the officer $2, I placed the papers in my pocket and started with my 2 friends to our hotel. I thought at the time, I must confess, that the papers were scarcely worth the cost of obtaining them, the apprehension of danger to my personal safety never having suggested itself to me in the remotest manner. The clerk, to whom we were directed, I remember made a memorandum in a large book, which I presume is in the office yet. A reference to the entries during the latter part of March or 1st of April, 1841, I have no doubt will satisfy the incredulous, at least so far as this particular transaction is concerned. With the evidence of freedom in my possession, the next day after our arrival in New York, we crossed the ferry to Jersey City and took the road to Philadelphia. Here we remained 1 night, continuing our journey towards Baltimore early in the morning. In due time we arrived in the latter city and stopped at a hotel near the railroad depot, either kept by a Mr. Rathbone or known as the Rathbone House. All the way from New York, their anxiety to reach the circus seemed to grow more and more intense. We left the carriage at Baltimore, and entering the cars proceeded to Washington, at which place we arrived just at nightfall, the evening previous to the funeral of General Harrison, and stopped at Gadsby's Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue. After supper they called me to their apartments, and paid me $43, a sum greater than my wages amounted to, which act of generosity was in consequence, they said, of their not having exhibited as often as they had given me to anticipate during our trip from Saratoga. They moreover informed me that it had been the intention of the circus company to leave Washington the next morning, but that on account of the funeral they had concluded to remain another day. They were then, as they had been from the time of our first meeting, extremely kind. No opportunity was omitted of addressing me in the language of approbation. While, on the other hand, I was certainly much prepossessed in their favor. I gave them my confidence without reserve, and would freely have trusted them to almost any extent. Their constant conversation and manner towards me, their foresight in suggesting the idea of free papers, and 100 other little acts, unnecessary to be repeated, all indicated that they were friends indeed, sincerely solicitous for my welfare. I know not but they were. I know not but they were innocent of the great wickedness of which I now believe them guilty. Whether they were accessory to my misfortunes, subtle and inhuman monsters in the shape of men, designedly luring me away from home and family, and liberty, for the sake of gold, those read these pages will have the same means of determining as myself, if they were innocent. My sudden disappearance must have been unaccountable indeed. But revolving in my mind all the attending circumstances, I never yet could indulge towards them so charitable a supposition. After receiving the money from them, of which they appeared to have an abundance, they advised me not to go into the streets that night, inasmuch as I was unacquainted with the customs of the city. Promising to remember their advice, I left them together, and soon after was shown by a colored servant to a sleeping room in the back part of the hotel on the ground floor. I laid down to rest, thinking of home and wife and children, and the long distance that stretched between us until I fell asleep. But no good angel of pity came to my bedside, bidding me to fly, No voice of mercy forewarned me in my dreams of the trials that were just at hand. The next day there was a great pageant in Washington. The roar of cannon and the tolling of bells filled the air, while many houses were shrouded with crape, and the streets were black with people. As the day advanced, the procession made its appearance, coming slowly through the avenue, carriage after carriage, in long succession, while thousands upon thousands followed on foot, all moving to the sound of melancholy music. They were bearing the dead body of Harrison to the grave. From early in the morning, I was constantly in the company of Hamilton and Brown. They were the only persons I knew in Washington. We stood together as the funeral pomp passed by. I remember distinctly how the window glass would break and rattle to the ground after each report of the cannon they were firing in the burial ground. We went to the Capitol and walked a long time about the grounds. In the afternoon, they strolled towards the President's house, all the time keeping me near to them, and pointing out various places of interest. As yet, I had seen nothing of the circus. In fact, I had thought of it but little, if at all, amidst the excitement of the day. My friends, several times during the afternoon, entered drinking saloons and called for liquor. They were by no means in the habit, however, so far as I knew them, of indulging to excess. On these occasions, after serving themselves, they would pour out a glass and hand it to me. I did not become intoxicated, as may be inferred from what subsequently occurred. Towards evening, and soon after partaking of one of these potations, I began to experience most unpleasant sensations. I felt extremely ill. My head commenced aching, a dull, heavy pain, inexpressibly disagreeable. At the supper table, I was without appetite. The sight and flavor of food was nauseous. About dark, the same servant conducted me to the room I had occupied the previous night. Brown and Hamilton advised me to retire, commiserating me kindly and expressing hopes that I would be better in the morning. Divesting myself of coat and boots merely, I threw myself upon the bed. It was impossible to sleep. The pain in my head continued to increase until it became almost unbearable. In a short time I became thirsty. My lips were parched. I could think of nothing but water, of lakes and flowing rivers, of brooks where I had stooped to drink, and of the dripping bucket, rising with its cool and overflowing nectar from the bottom of the well. Towards midnight, as near as I could judge, I arose, unable longer to bear such intensity of thirst. I was a stranger in the house, and knew nothing of its apartments. There was no one up, as I could observe. Groping about at random, I knew not where, I found the way at last to a kitchen in the basement. 2 or 3 colored servants were moving through it, one of whom, a woman, gave me 2 glasses of water. It afforded momentary relief, but by the time I had reached my room again, the same burning desire of drink, the same tormenting thirst, had again returned. It was even more torturing than before, as was also the wild pain in my head, if such a thing could be. I was in sore distress, in most excruciating agony. I seemed to stand on the brink of madness. The memory of that night of horrible suffering will follow me to the grave. In the course of an hour or more after my return from the kitchen, I was conscious of someone entering my room. There seemed to be several, a mingling of various voices, but how many or who they were I cannot tell. Whether Brown and Hamilton were among them is a mere matter of conjecture. I only remember with any degree of distinctness that I was told it was necessary to go to a physician and procure medicine, and that, pulling on my boots without coat or hat, I followed them through a long passageway or alley into the open street. It ran out at right angles from Pennsylvania Avenue. On the opposite side there was a light burning in a window. My impression is there were then 3 persons with me, but it is altogether indefinite and vague, and like the memory of a painful dream. Going towards the light, which I imagined proceeded from a physician's office, and which seemed to recede as I advanced, is the last glimmering recollection I can now recall. From that moment I was insensible. How long I remained in that condition, whether only that night or many days and nights, I do not know. But when consciousness returned, I found myself alone, in utter darkness and in chains. The pain in my head had subsided in a measure, but I was very faint and weak. I was sitting upon a low bench made of rough boards, and without coat or hat. I was handcuffed. Around my ankles also were a pair of hefty fetters. One end of a chain was fastened to a large ring in the floor, the other to the fetters on my ankles. I tried in vain to stand upon my feet. Waking from such a painful trance, it was some time before I could collect my thoughts. Where was I? What was the meaning of these chains? Where were Brown and Hamilton? What had I done to deserve imprisonment in such a dungeon? I could not comprehend. There was a blank of some indefinite period preceding my awakening in that lonely place, the events of which the utmost stretch of memory was unable to recall. I listened intently for some sign or sound of life, but nothing broke the oppressive silence, save the clinking of my chains whenever I chanced to move. I spoke aloud, but the sound of my voice startled me. I felt of my pockets, so far as the fetters would allow, far enough indeed to ascertain that I had not only been robbed of liberty, but that my money and free papers were also gone. Then did the idea begin to break upon my mind, at first dim and confused, that I had been kidnapped, but that, I thought, was incredible. There must have been some misapprehension, some unfortunate mistake. It could not be that a free citizen of New York, who had wronged no man, nor violated any law, should be dealt with thus inhumanly. The more I contemplated my situation, however, the more I became confirmed in my suspicions. It was a desolate thought, indeed. I felt there was no trust or mercy in unfeeling man, and, commending myself to the God of the oppressed, bowed my head upon my fettered hands and wept most bitterly. Chapter 3. Some 3 hours elapsed, during which time I remained seated on the low bench, absorbed in painful meditations. At length I heard the crowing of a cock, and soon a distant rumbling sound, as of carriages hurrying through the streets, came to my ears, and I knew that it was day. No ray of light, however, penetrated my prison. Finally I heard footsteps immediately overhead, as of someone walking to and fro. It occurred to me then that I must be in an underground apartment, and the damp, mouldy odors of the place confirmed the supposition. The noise above continued for at least an hour, when at last I heard footsteps approaching from without. A key rattled in the lock. A strong door swung back upon its hinges, admitting a flood of light, and 2 men entered and stood before me. One of them was a large, powerful man, 40 years of age, perhaps, with dark chestnut-colored hair, slightly interspersed with gray. His face was full, his complexion flush, his features grossly coarse, expressive of nothing but cruelty and cunning. He was about 5 feet 10 inches high, of full habit, and without prejudice, I must be allowed to say, was a man whose whole appearance was sinister and repugnant. His name was James H. Birch, as I learned afterwards, a well-known slave dealer in Washington, and then, or lately connected in business, as a partner with Theophilus Freeman of New Orleans. The person who accompanied him was a simple lackey named Ebenezer Radburn, who acted merely in the capacity of turnkey. Both of these men still live in Washington, or did at the time of my return through that city from slavery in January last. The light admitted through the open door enabled me to observe the room in which I was confined. It was about 12 feet square, the walls of solid masonry, the floor was of heavy plank. There was one small window, crossed with great iron bars, with an outside shutter securely fastened. An iron-bound door led into an adjoining cell, or vault, wholly destitute of windows, or any means of admitting light. The furniture of the room in which I was consisted of the wooden bench on which I sat, an old-fashioned dirty box stove, and besides these, in either cell, there was neither bed, nor blanket, nor any other thing whatever. The door, through which Birch and Radburn entered, led through a small passage, up a flight of steps into a yard, surrounded by a brick wall 10 or 12 feet high, immediately in rear of a building of the same width as itself. The yard extended rearward from the house about 30 feet. In one part of the wall there was a strongly ironed door, opening into a narrow, covered passage, leading along one side of the house into the street. The doom of the colored man, upon whom the door leading out of that narrow passage closed, was sealed. The top of the wall supported one end of a roof which ascended inwards, forming a kind of open shed. Underneath the roof there was a crazy loft all around, where slaves, if so disposed, might sleep at night, or in inclement weather seek shelter from the storm. It was like a farmer's barnyard in most respects, save it was so constructed that the outside world could never see the human cattle that were herded there. The building to which the yard was attached was 2 stories high, fronting on one of the public streets of Washington. Its outside presented only the appearance of a quiet, private residence. A stranger looking at it would never have dreamed of its execrable uses. Strange as it may seem, within plain sight of this same house, looking down from its commanding height upon it, was the Capitol. The voices of patriotic representatives boasting of freedom and equality, and the rattling of the poor slaves' chains almost commingled. A slave pen within the very shadow of the Capitol. Such is a correct description, as it was in 1841, of William's slave pen in Washington, in one of the cellars of which I found myself so unaccountably confined. "Well, my boy, how do you feel now?" said Birch, as he entered through the open door. I replied that I was sick, and inquired the cause of my imprisonment. He answered that I was his slave, that he had bought me, and that he was about to send me to New Orleans. I asserted, aloud and boldly, that I was a freeman, a resident of Saratoga, where I had a wife and children who were also free, and that my name was Northup. I complained bitterly of the strange treatment I had received, and threatened, upon my liberation, to have satisfaction for the wrong. He denied that I was free, and with an emphatic oath declared that I came from Georgia. Again and again I asserted I was no man's slave, and insisted upon his taking off my chains at once. He endeavored to hush me, as if he feared my voice would be overheard. But I would not be silent, and denounced the authors of my imprisonment, whoever they might be, as unmitigated villains. Finding he could not quiet me, he flew into a towering passion. With blasphemous oaths, he called me a black liar, a runaway from Georgia, and every other profane and vulgar epithet that the most indecent fancy could conceive. During this time, Radburn was standing silently by. His business was to oversee this human, or rather inhuman, stable, receiving slaves, feeding, and whipping them, at the rate of 2 shillings a head per day. Turning to him, Birch ordered the paddle and cat-o'-nine-tails to be brought in. He disappeared, and in a few moments returned with these instruments of torture. The paddle, as it is termed in slave-beating parlance, or at least the one with which I first became acquainted, and of which I now speak, was a piece of hardwood board, 18 or 20 inches long, molded to the shape of an old-fashioned pudding-stick, or ordinary oar. The flattened portion, which was about the size in circumference of 2 open hands, was bored with a small auger in numerous places. The cat was a large rope of many strands, the strands unraveled, and a knot tied at the extremity of each. As soon as these formidable whips appeared, I was seized by both of them, and roughly divested of my clothing. My feet, as has been stated, were fastened to the floor. Drawing me over the bench, face downwards, Radburn placed his heavy foot upon the fetters, between my wrists, holding them painfully to the floor. With the paddle, Birch commenced beating me. Blow after blow was inflicted upon my naked body. When his unrelenting arm grew tired, he stopped and asked if I still insisted I was a free man. I did insist upon it, and then the blows were renewed faster and more energetically, if possible, than before. When again tired, he would repeat the same question, and receiving the same answer, continue his cruel labor. All this time the incarnate devil was uttering most fiendish oaths. At length the paddle broke, leaving the useless handle in his hand. Still I would not yield. All his brutal blows could not force from my lips the foul lie that I was a slave. Casting madly on the floor the handle of the broken paddle, he seized the rope. This was far more painful than the other. I struggled with all my power, but it was in vain. I prayed for mercy, but my prayer was only answered with imprecations and with stripes. I thought I must die beneath the lashes of the accursed brute. Even now the flesh crawls upon my bones as I recall the scene. I was all on fire. My sufferings I can compare to nothing else than the burning agonies of hell. At last I became silent to his repeated questions. I would make no reply. In fact, I was becoming almost unable to speak. Still he plied the lash without stint upon my poor body, until it seemed that the lacerated flesh was stripped from my bones at every stroke. A man with a particle of mercy in his soul would not have beaten even a dog so cruelly. At length Radburn said that it was useless to whip me any more, that I would be sore enough. Thereupon Birch desisted, saying, with an admonitory shake of his fist in my face, and hissing the words through his firm set teeth, that if ever I dared to utter again that I was entitled to my freedom, that I had been kidnapped, or anything whatever of the kind, the castigation I had just received was nothing in comparison with what would follow. He swore that he would either conquer or kill me. With these consolatory words the fetters were taken from my wrists, my feet still remaining fastened to the ring. The shutter of the little barred window, which had been opened, was again closed, and going out, locking the great door behind them, I was left in darkness, as before. In an hour, perhaps 2, my heart leaped to my throat, as the key rattled in the door again. I, who had been so lonely, and who had longed so ardently to see someone, I cared not who, now shuddered at the thought of man's approach. A human face was fearful to me, especially a white one. Radburn entered, bringing with him, on a tin plate, a piece of shriveled fried pork, a slice of bread, and a cup of water. He asked me how I felt, and remarked that I had received a pretty severe flogging. He remonstrated with me against the propriety of asserting my freedom. In rather a patronizing and confidential manner, he gave it to me as his advice that the less I said on that subject, the better it would be for me. The man evidently endeavored to appear kind, whether touched at the sight of my sad condition, or with the view of silencing, on my part, any further expression of my rights. It is not necessary now to conjecture. He unlocked the fetters from my ankles, opened the shutters of the little window, and departed, leaving me again alone. By this time I had become stiff and sore, my body was covered with blisters, and it was with great pain and difficulty that I could move. From the window I could observe nothing but the roof resting on the adjacent wall. At night I laid down upon the damp, hard floor, without any pillow or covering whatever. Punctually, twice a day, Radburn came in, with his pork and bread and water. I had but little appetite, though I was tormented with continual thirst. My wounds would not permit me to remain but a few minutes in any one position, so, sitting or standing, or moving slowly around, I passed the days and nights. I was heartsick and discouraged. Thoughts of my family, of my wife and children, continually occupied my mind. When sleep overpowered me, I dreamed of them, dreamed I was again in Saratoga, that I could see their faces and hear their voices calling me. Awakening from the pleasant phantasms of sleep to the bitter realities around me, I could but groan and weep. Still my spirit was not broken. I indulged the anticipation of escape, and that speedily. It was impossible, I reasoned, that men could be so unjust as to detain me as a slave, when the truth of my case was known. Birch, ascertaining I was no runaway from Georgia, would certainly let me go. Though suspicions of Brown and Hamilton were not unfrequent, I could not reconcile myself to the idea that they were instrumental to my imprisonment. Surely they would seek me out. They would deliver me from thraldom. Alas, I had not then learned the measure of man's inhumanity to man, nor to what limitless extent of wickedness he will go for the love of gain. In the course of several days the outer door was thrown open, allowing me the liberty of the yard. There I found 3 slaves, one of them a lad of 10 years, the others young men of about 20 and 25. I was not long in forming an acquaintance, and learning their names and the particulars of their history. The eldest was a colored man named Clemens Ray. He had lived in Washington, had driven a hack, and worked in a livery stable there for a long time. He was very intelligent, and fully comprehended his situation. The thought of going south overwhelmed him with grief. Birch had purchased him a few days before, and had placed him there until such time as he was ready to send him to the New Orleans market. From him I learned for the first time that I was in William's slave pen, a place I had never heard of previously. He described to me the uses for which it was designed. I repeated to him the particulars of my unhappy story, but he could only give me the consolation of his sympathy. He also advised me to be silent henceforth on the subject of my freedom, for, knowing the character of Birch, he assured me that it would only be attended with renewed whipping. The next eldest was named John Williams. He was raised in Virginia, not far from Washington. Birch had taken him in payment of a debt, and he constantly entertained the hope that his master would redeem him, a hope that was subsequently realized. The lad was a sprightly child that answered to the name of Randall. Most of the time he was playing about the yard, but occasionally would cry, calling for his mother, and wondering when she would come. His mother's absence seemed to be the great and only grief in his little heart. He was too young to realize his condition, and when the memory of his mother was not in his mind, he amused us with his pleasant pranks. At night, Ray, Williams, and the boy slept in the loft of the shed, while I was locked in the cell. Finally, we were each provided with blankets, such as are used upon horses, the only bedding I was allowed to have for 12 years afterwards. Ray and Williams asked me many questions about New York, how colored people were treated there, how they could have homes and families of their own, with none to disturb and oppress them, and Ray, especially, sighed continually for freedom. Such conversations, however, were not in the hearing of Birch or the keeper Radburn. Aspirations such as these would have brought down the lash upon our backs. It is necessary in this narrative, in order to present a full and truthful statement of all the principal events in the history of my life, and to portray the institution of slavery as I have seen and known it, to speak of well-known places, and of many persons who are yet living. I am, and always was, an entire stranger in Washington and its vicinity. Aside from Birch and Radburn, knowing no man there, except as I have heard of them through my enslaved companions, what I am about to say, if false, can be easily contradicted. I remained in William's slave pen about 2 weeks. The night previous to my departure, a woman was brought in, weeping bitterly, and leading by the hand a little child. They were Randall's mother and half-sister. On meeting them, he was overjoyed, clinging to her dress, kissing the child, and exhibiting every demonstration of delight. The mother also clasped him in her arms, embraced him tenderly, and gazed at him fondly through her tears, calling him by many an endearing name. Emily, the child, was 7 or 8 years old, of light complexion and with a face of admirable beauty. Her hair fell in curls around her neck, while the style and richness of her dress and the neatness of her whole appearance indicated she had been brought up in the midst of wealth. She was a sweet child indeed. The woman also was arrayed in silk, with rings upon her fingers and golden ornaments suspended from her ears. Her air and manners, the correctness and propriety of her language, all showed evidently that she had sometimes stood above the common level of a slave. She seemed to be amazed at finding herself in such a place as that. It was plainly a sudden and unexpected turn of fortune that had brought her there. Filling the air with her complaining, she was hustled, with the children and myself, into the cell. Language can convey but an inadequate impression of the lamentations to which she gave incessant utterance. Throwing herself upon the floor, and encircling the children in her arms, she poured forth such touching words as only maternal love and kindness can suggest. They nestled closely to her, as if there only was there any safety or protection. At last they slept, their heads resting upon her lap. While they slumbered, she smoothed the hair back from their little foreheads, and talked to them all night long. She called them her darlings, her sweet babes, poor innocent things, that knew not the misery they were destined to endure. Soon they would have no mother to comfort them. They would be taken from her. What would become of them? Oh, she could not live away from her little Emmy and her dear boy. They had always been good children, and had such loving ways. It would break her heart, God knew, she said, if they were taken from her. And yet she knew they meant to sell them, and maybe they would be separated and could never see each other any more. It was enough to melt heart of stone to listen to the pitiful expressions of that desolate and distracted mother. Her name was Eliza, and this was the story of her life, as she afterwards related it. She was the slave of Elisha Berry, a rich man, living in the neighborhood of Washington. She was born, I think she said, on his plantation. Years before, he had fallen into dissipated habits and quarreled with his wife. In fact, soon after the birth of Randall, they separated. Leaving his wife and daughter in the house they had always occupied, he erected a new one nearby, on the estate. Into this house he brought Eliza, and on condition of her living with him, she and her children were to be emancipated. She resided with him there 9 years, with servants to attend upon her, and provided with every comfort and luxury of life. Emily was his child. Finally, her young mistress, who had always remained with her mother at the homestead, married a Mr. Jacob Brooks, at length, for some cause, as I gathered from her relation, beyond Barry's control, a division of his property was made. She and her children fell to the share of Mr. Brooks. During the 9 years she had lived with Barry, in consequence of the position she was compelled to occupy, she and Emily had become the object of Mrs. Barry and her daughter's hatred and dislike. Barry himself she represented as a man of naturally a kind heart, who always promised her that she should have her freedom, and who, she had no doubt, would warrant it to her then, if it were only in his power. As soon as they thus came into the possession and control of the daughter, it became very manifest they would not live long together. The sight of Eliza seemed to be odious to Mrs. Brooks. Neither could she bear to look upon the child, half-sister, and beautiful as she was. The day she was led into the pen, Brooks had brought her from the estate into the city, under pretense that the time had come when her free papers were to be executed in fulfillment of her master's promise. Elated at the prospect of immediate liberty, she decked herself and little Emmy in their best apparel, and accompanied him with a joyful heart. On their arrival in the city, instead of being baptized into the family of freemen, she was delivered to the traitor Birch. The paper that was executed was a bill of sale. The hope of years was blasted in a moment. From the height of most exulting happiness to the utmost depths of wretchedness, she had that day descended. No wonder that she wept and filled the pen with wailings and expressions of heart-rending woe. Eliza is now dead. Far up the Red River, where it pours its waters sluggishly through the unhealthy lowlands of Louisiana, she rests in the grave at last, the only resting place of the poor slave. How all her fears were realized, how she mourned day and night, and never would be comforted. How, as she predicted, her heart did indeed break with the burden of maternal sorrow, will be seen as the narrative proceeds.
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. The number again, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. I'm almost pleased that I have not seen Steve McQueen's film. As we are doing the study session on 12 Years a Slave, I have not even seen Gordon Parks' Solomon Northrup's Odyssey. That way I will be able to give a better comparison contrast when I finally see both of the films. I'm most interested to see how they narrate how Mr. Northup ended up being enslaved in the first place. Very interested. At any rate, for folks who do not want to use their phone, if you wish to participate, you can use the flash phone, which is free and works anywhere in the world. If you are listening at Black Talk Radio, there should be a obvious black button in the center of the page where you can call the program. If you're not there, the URL is tiny, tiny.cc/1 race, and it's the number 1. The address again, tiny.cc/1 race. Feel free, dial in. Definitely looking forward to hearing thoughts on what people have to say about the first 3 chapters of 12 Years a Slave. Pretty much all I have to say is this is example number, I guess, 8,362,021 on the dangers of white friends. And alcohol. I think that is something that I mention all the time. We will hit the phone lines. The person that dialed in, I guess you're using the flash dialer thing. Your line should be open, and this is Mr. Demery 4. Your line should be open as well. As I see other hands, I will open those lines also.
Greetings, Gus. Am I being heard?
Greetings, 404. Good to hear from you.
You too, as well as Mr. Demery 4. My phone is acting up, so please bear with me. Hopefully it wouldn't drop again. But unfortunately, I did go to see the movie for the first time. I went to the movies in over 10 years, so I'm not even going to mention the movie until we get to the end of it. But the first 3 chapters, I'm reading this book here, and as you said, alcohol, white friends, this blind trust that he have in white people, as he expressed in trusting these people, that referring to them as gentlemen and everything else, that he still can't believe that they were the ones to con him and sold him into slavery. But it's not so much alcohol. He was drugged because the effect that it had on him, the headaches, the thirst, the everything else that was going on with him, they drugged him. It's not so much that he had the alcohol, but they put something in his food and his drink in order to knock him out so that they can sell him. And the other thing, as you said, with the trusting also that I found inconceivable is that when he went to New York and they said he drafted up the free papers for him, he never looked at those papers. And my whole thing is that those papers could have been a paper to say that he was the property of these 2 men. So when he got to Washington, D.C., because they were so anxious to leave from New York to get to D.C., that they practically rode through the whole night until they got there. And then they started this, this whole charade. No circus was in sight, trying to, to get him to go and see the sightseeing and all these other distractions to try to get him to do. Then all of a sudden, one of these men disappeared, and he's in shackles in the basement of this slave place that was sold off. So, it, as you said, this blind trust that we have in white people and always wanting to believe what's before us. We always want to look for something else and not see what is before us, that these people, they trick us. And as your caller says, Mr. Wagner, that he said how they can do all this double speech, they can talk, they can laugh, they can put forth this image of being so congenial and so friendly, when all along in the back of their mind, behind that smiling face, they are plotting your device. And this is a clear example with these 2 men, white men, who showed up and conned him into coming along with them, knowing all along that they plan on selling him into bondage. I'll mute myself and let Mr. Demery 4 could express himself.
Mr. Demery 4, are you with us?
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, greetings, Gus. Greetings to 404. Excellent commentary and excellent observations. I did see Gordon Parks' adaptation of 12 Years a Slave, and I did not read the book, and I haven't seen the new movie, but from what I've gathered from the first 3 chapters, there's a little bit of difference in Gordon Parks' movie, but not much. My observations were similar to 404, but I found that the 2 gentlemen that tricked Mr. Northrup were, the way the book described them, one was effeminate, and the other one was short and stern-looking. That seemed like that would raise a flag in itself, because, in that time, he was used to seeing white people, it seemed, because he had a talent where he could play the fiddle. And so he ran into white people from time to time. But it seemed that he was naive about the horrors of slavery. Maybe his father did not, tell him about the experience. He came into contact with some black people, but they were enslaved Africans. And he didn't speak very fondly of them. It was almost like he spoke in a condescending manner, like he didn't even mention their names, and said that he didn't emphasize any escape methods for them. I think the 2 gentlemen did drug him. They put a Mickey in his drink, and those papers that he had were probably suspicious, and he was robbed of any money he had. I thought it was strange that he would just leave without notifying anyone that he was leaving, or leave a note for his wife. And I think that white people know us so well that they knew exactly what Solomon would fall for. The exact amount of money, giving him compliments on his talent for playing the fiddle, enticing him with travel, and when he was captured also, the good cop, bad cop method that Mr. Birch and Mr. Radburn were using on him were all first steps in this process of humiliation and to get him to a point to where they could control him. I thought it was extremely unfortunate for Elijah to have been tricked by the white man. She had a child by him and ended up getting sold into slavery herself. Those are my observations. Thanks for the cowbell. Now mute my line. Thank you.
Not only that, if I could interject just a little, not only that, I believe by him growing up in New York, where he has been around white people so much as a free person, He wasn't exposed to around a lot of blacks compared to the enslaved blacks. He developed this level of trust and comfort and ease in being around white people that the normal instinct for someone black to have your guard up, it was not in place. So when these people came along and they promised him to pay him $1 a day and give him all of this large sums of money in order for him to play this gig, and they did give him the money because he said he received $43. They gave him the same night that I guess they knew all along that they were going to get this money back, because once he was drugged and they dragged him off and sold him, they were going to get this $43 back as well as whatever amount of money they got for selling him. So they played the game very, very well, and as you said, with the flashiness in their style of dress and their appearance, it was something that he just was not, his level of suspicion, like myself and you, it was not there. And that's what comes about from when you are around white people so much, and you come have this false sense that they are so-called good white people, and that, I've always lived around them, they've always treated me nicely, so I don't need to be on my guard. And that is what happened with him. His whole thing was shattered. And Eliza, I felt sorry for her, because here it is that she felt that she was almost in a white status, and knowing that this woman, they hated her guts because she is black. And the minute she got an opportunity, the dangers of white women, once again, it shows you the devious nature of white women. And as the story goes along further, you're going to see that manifest itself, where we like to give white females a pass, and they are the most vicious in this story. You will see the evilness in their ways, which is what happened. Because the woman, she could care less that that's her half sister. As far as she's concerned, that's a nigger. I don't even care if she would look whatever she looked. She is not white. She's a half white child. So therefore, I don't care. I want to get it out of my sight. I want them all off the property, so I don't have any reminders. Do whatever I'll get some money, plus I'll get rid of them. And that's what was done with Eliza and her children.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Oh, okay. I was just, I was thinking I had to press the star and everything, but I'm in the queue now, so okay. Yeah, I agree with everything both callers said. Dangerous, dangerous, dangerous white woman. You know what, I just got finished looking at the movie. I got in from the movie 10 minutes before I called into the show. I didn't even know this was going to be on today. It's everything just kind of clicked. And yeah, she's right. Throughout the rest of the movie, I think Steve McQueen does a good job at pointing out the treacherousness. I mean, just the downright nastiness of the white female. I wanted to add also that, a lot of talk, it always comes up around the subject of slavery, around, who sold who and who stole what. And I always take Mr. Fuller's stance, no person can sell any person. But this shows you just the levels that people even in the States used to go ahead and capture a human being, and the way that it probably took place, even on the continent, to capture other human beings too. Because at the end of the day, they had to take possession of the property through deceit and direct violence eventually to go ahead on and make the transaction happen. And yes, Mr. Northrup was very trusting of people, of white people. I think the history that his family had his father had his contract honored there by the slave master. Upon his death, he set him free in the will. So I guess Solomon kind of had a view that I guess they somewhat could keep their word. He eventually finds out that that's not the case, but white friends again. And I want you to look. We can relate this to the whole Richie Incognito case. I'm getting off the subject, but I have to tie this into it because we know everything's related when it comes to white supremacy. in the locker room, I'm pretty sure Richie Incognito was probably somebody who walked around with what we call swag, or an individual who probably kicked it with the brothers, Nigga came out of his mouth, and like a lot of us do, a lot of less codified victims, we tend to find that amusing. And black people definitely are always looking to bring some other people into the group, especially other non-black people. It makes us feel good. That's just in our nature, I guess. But yeah, I noticed that Richie Incognito, he gets suspended indefinitely. Jonathan Martin leaves the team. I'm saying all that to say this. The blame never got placed on who it should have got placed on. Jonathan Martin, the black man, was absolutely the victim. But even here, we don't view them. We don't view white folks as being harmful like they're supposed to be. I'm guilty of it, and I still run around with people who I call not friends, but they're white acquaintances that I really don't have to have. They really don't add anything to my existence. But he was definitely drugged, and being there in the pen, I think I just like to see the humanity of him and the other brothers. Even though most everybody there was probably coming from a free state or a state that wasn't as bad, I guess, as your regular slave. They all kind of got together and had fun, and I liked the way they took care of the young black man that was there with him, the 10-year-old that they, had with them. So once again, in the first 3 chapters, the humanity of black people, I swear to God, I do not know where we get it from. I don't understand how we have put up with this stuff and not either committed suicide or a massive homicide. And in the movie, when you go see it, you'll ask yourself that too. Thank you.
I know. 2 other people that dialed in, 1922 and 7537. Your lines are both open. I did want to get in because I think sometimes, I don't even think, I know this has been done deliberately, the 2 points that you just raised, because I've heard this before on the program where people say, I don't know how black people haven't done some sort of mass homicide in response to the way we've been terrorized and or suicide. Both of those have happened in great numbers, whether you want to go more recently with Christopher Dorner, Lavelle Mixon down in the East Bay area, Colin Ferguson in New York. If you want more recent incidents, Maurice Clemens, that was right here in Washington State not that long ago. If you need to go all the way back to Nat Turner, that's fine. Denmark Vesey, blah, blah, blah. That has happened probably more times than we can even account in 50 programs. And the suicides, that has happened in mass numbers as well. It's been, and white people have done a phenomenal job of erasing and making sure that is not discussed, particularly the incidents where it has been counter-violence directed at white people. They have done a fabulous job of making that something that does not get talked about. The other 2 folks, your lines are both open.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Greetings, everyone. Excuse me. Yeah, I'm really liking the book, but my only comment is I just kind of find it hard to believe that Solomon Northrup didn't know that. I mean, I'm pretty sure during his day he must have heard stories about slaves who were free and got captured and became slaves again. I mean, I find that part unbelievable. That was my only comment.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, evening, everyone. My quick comment is the fact that the 10-year-old Randall, it seemed that he didn't really understand his condition, and I guess nobody didn't really have the heart to explain it to him, and I guess that's kind of a tragic thing about this whole situation, that even though this child was longing for his mother and was happy to see her once she finally came, he still didn't really understand what was going on. and the fact that it took Solomon a few days to even realize that he'd been tricked and kidnapped. It's really sad that they didn't catch upon this sooner, or even try to avoid it. But I don't know. That's my comment.
Sadly,
I got another.
Oh, go ahead.
I got another comment. Sorry, I got another comment. I there's a little contradiction. Didn't he say before he met those two fellas from those guys were traveling out of town or whatever? Didn't he say that he was doing pretty well, like he was doing modestly well, and for him to want to go to fall for the hook, line, and sinker and try to get like big money from those guys? I mean, I figured if you're doing fairly well, like why would you be enticed to you know what I'm saying? That was my only, like, I felt that was a contradiction, because there was a part in there where he did say he was doing well and that he saving up his money and he was he was doing all right, and then these two fellas come and then all of a sudden they're promising him big money and then he jumps to it. Like, I don't know. That to me that was seemed a bit contradictory, but I could be wrong though.
I wouldn't say what he said in the beginning. I could be incorrect. Was during the down season when he does agriculture and lumber work. Then in the winter months when that is no longer available because of the winter season, he does his musical career thing. And it was during this time period when he was looking for work during that off season, when these men appear and offer him this gig to be their musician, and this is what they were going to pay him. So it was not during the time when he was doing the regular lumber agricultural part of his job, during that good time of the year when the weather was somewhat much better.
Let me ask the question too. I got the part about him doing the music gig, but didn't him and the wife, they sold the farm in Saratoga? Is that correct?
I think that's accurate.
Yeah, I think they had sold. If he said that, I remember he had made a statement where there was a part in there where he said that if they could have stayed on the farm, the 25 acres of corn that he had planted, they could have stayed on that farm and done quite well at the rate they were going. They would have been great. But at some point he went to Saratoga, and during this time in Saratoga and going and looking for off-season work, that's when the incident took place. Because I thought that he had higher expectations for Saratoga than actually were realized by him and his family.
Exactly. He didn't want to be a farmer per se. He felt his musical skills was going to do much better, and plus his wife, she was this great cook, chef, whatever, and she was doing this work. I think basically he didn't want her out of the house. He didn't want her working for these other people, and he felt that if he couldn't do a good job in his musical career, then perhaps she wouldn't have to be doing this job as a cook, and him doing these other odd jobs. He could just take this money and they can possibly maybe set up a business or whatever where they wouldn't have to be split up as they were.
The person that dialed in from a block number, did you have a commentary you wanted to add? Person that dialed in from a block number, you had a hand up. Did you have something you wanted to add in?
It's Karma. Okay. Good evening. I just wanted to contribute that, yes, you can be that innocent and naive about white people for a very long time into your adulthood. It is entirely possible.
I wanted to put in, I think this is another one of those parallels, unfortunately. I think we did a lot of this when we were doing Warmth of Other Suns, that in this book, which is even older, we're talking 19th century, where when they were talking about the children, Randall and them not, even our main character, Mr. Northup, not understanding what was happening to them. That is like 98% of non-white people right now, 2013, not really understanding things that are happening to them in so many different situations, be it on the job, whether it's being stopped by enforcement officers, but being in positions where we're being harmed and we don't really understand what's happening. We don't really believe, wow, they couldn't really be doing this to me. They couldn't really be abusing me like that. I mean, that is happening right now as we speak to non-white people, and just not understanding racism. And as I've said consistently, you can substitute racism with whites at any time, and it will still make sense. If you do not understand white people, everything else that you understand will confuse you. And I think you see that same, he even says that he was confused. Mr. North, he says it repeatedly. He was confused, not understanding what was happening. Yeah. Check. Go ahead.
There was just one other thing I wanted to say about the context of the book. I noticed that he referred to himself as a citizen of New York, and I think that this is a time in U.S. history when the states were still very fractured. They didn't think of themselves as a united States. And the South was very, very powerful up until the Civil War and dictated a great number of things about the country. And also I wanted to say that when I was looking at it, there was something kind of strange on the cover page about 5,000. And anything to do with a fifth, 3/5, or anything seems to be very repetitive in our history. And the only thing I could see that referenced 5,000 that was on the cover of the book was that this was either referring to the second edition of Charles Darwin's Origin of a Species, or it's referring to the Christian period of the 5,000 years after the Germans came onto the scene, which is strange. But those are two things I noticed, and both of those are just very interesting. And the last thing that I noticed was at the beginning of the book, he dedicated it not to his wife and children, but to Harriet Beecher Stowe, the white woman who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin.
I caught that as well. I
thought that was interesting.
This book apparently was published right after Uncle Tom's Cabin, so I guess it got a lot of popularity. I think they even compare and contrast. If you look at some of the reviews where they say, I think that's in the beginning of this book, if you look at the preface, where they say that this book highlights or emphasizes a lot of the things that happened to Uncle Tom in that book. And that's another one of those, trusting whites, and especially I would say with Harriet Beecher Stowe, because we have talked about her before, how she wrote that book. But if you continue to follow the timeline of her life, she did the same thing that you will see with most white people in making very racist comments and saying she didn't think that well of black people. This is in, we had him on the program. Oh, I'll have to look and get his name because I have his audio book as well. We won't be doing it on the program because it's very long, but he goes in detail talking about how Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was white. What does it mean to be a white person? She gives you a great demonstration. All you have to do is follow the arc of her life, where she expresses the same racist white supremacist views that you would expect any white person to. The name of the book is Dave Goldfield, America Aflame. Dave Goldfield, America Aflame, and he gives great information about Harriet Beecher Stowe being racist, just like you would expect any other white person.
I heard that she was accused of plagiarizing that Uncle Tom's Cabin, like she didn't really write that. Have you guys heard similar things?
Yes, I've heard it too. Also, the suspended belief that we have, as a couple callers mentioned with the children, Randall and Emily, of not telling them what's going on. And it's something that we all do as adults, where we try to live in this make-believe world, as we do with religion, alcohol, drugs, whatever it is that we try to escape in and not face reality. And that is what she was doing with these children. Even though they were in this dungeon, they could look around and see what's going on with them. She somehow or the other tried to make it a comfortable existence by shielding them and not telling them the truth of what it is that's happening to them, right up until the end when everything just kind of fall apart and they're taken from her, and she is, as he said here, she died on the Red River from a broken heart. All along this not wanting to follow, to live up to reality. That's what's happening around us.
Just for the ending for me for.
Excuse me?
I say you just spoiled the ending for me.
No, it was mentioned in the first 3 chapters. That's what happened to her, Eliza. It says that at the end of chapter 3 that she died of a broken heart.
Oh, okay.
Oh, well,
I missed that part.
Since the non-belief, since we're talking about it, I want to jump in and say that you're right. I've seen a lot of videos here lately with brothers that are on YouTube or whatever that are getting stopped or accosted, that are getting accosted, harassed by the police and things like that. And I see incidents. I'm not criticizing. I'm saying I think we need to do more. I think we give these white people, suspected racists, way too much credit. I saw one video where the brother just he said all I did was put my hands up and ask the question. I would say to what Gus said, I think whenever the police hit the scene, just surrender. I'm so serious at this point. I'm seeing they're finding. I mean, I know they could pull an Oscar Grant or whatever, but nevertheless, total cooperation at any given time when enforcement officials are on the scene. That's what I do. I had them stop me at checkpoints. They put a checkpoint right by my house. It seems like it comes every weekend, and I'm probably going to get stopped there at least twice a month. Come through, same cops. Roll down the window, hand them my ID. You know, I've never had any outside conversation with these guys. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing. Not even friendly type stuff like, "Hey, I come through here all the time," or "Why do you guys put the roadblock right here on Crescent and Magnolia?" None of that. I'm thinking we need to. I think black men in general need to understand that we have to just go into complete whatever you say mode when faced with enforcement officials, and that was that.
Before we get to the next 2 chapters, for the people who've seen Steve McQueen's film of the book, how do they portray the sequence of Mr. Northrup being enslaved? Do they give you the impression that these 2 white guys were in cahoots and drugged him and just schemed to steal Northrup and have him enslaved? Or do they give you the impression that these were up and up white guys, these were, loyal white friends, and he was just accosted somehow and this just happened, but they were not a party to this?
It was done in flashback sequences, how they unfolded the story in the movie, but it showed in the end where he was trying to put it together as to how he ended up in this circumstance, that he suspected that these 2 men were the ones that sold him out, that tricked him and sold him into slavery. He didn't want to believe it, but he had to come to that conclusion, that is the only logical conclusion, that these 2 men were the ones that sold him into slavery.
I thought McQueen did a good job of leaving it up in the air when they first showed the scenes of him with the gentleman in Washington and the party that took place, the subsequent drink, and then Northrup going to bed and becoming sweatier and almost in a sickness. I couldn't tell at that point. It didn't seem to me like McQueen tried to paint him as the people who did him. I couldn't tell he was being duped. I thought something had happened to him, even though I'd seen the previous movie. The way that he depicted it in the film, I couldn't tell. I couldn't tell that these guys were there to harm him or not.
Interesting. I think that's something to pay attention to as we continue along in the book. Sympathetic white characters, good white people, benevolent white people that are not racist. I think that's something to definitely pay attention to as we continue along with the book. We can kind of contrast to people who've seen the film if they think that pops up in the film as well as the adaptation. Once he actually is sold and is on a for real obvious explicit plantation, how quickly he adapts to that. I think that's definitely something to pay attention to. That was something that I was kind of struck by, seeing that this was someone who was born a quote-unquote free black person, how quickly the acclimation process evolves for Mr. Northrup. There were, I guess this was actually from the very beginning. This is from the preface as well, where he, I guess this is a quote, where he says, because delivered down, he's talking about just the formal, obvious institution of slavery, because delivered down from sire to son is kept and guarded as a sacred thing. But is it fit, or can it bear the shock of rational discussion that a should be white man or woman, compounded and made up like other men of elements tumultuous, in whom lust and folly in as ample measure meet, as in the bosom of the slave he rules, should be a despot absolute and boast himself the only freeman of his land? Question. And I just feel like that it goes back to me, that fundamental misunderstanding of whites and trying to see that humanity in them. How can they do this to us? How can they think of themselves in this way as though they're supposed to dominate and rule over us, and they can't think of themselves this way? I'm a man just like you. I'm a woman just like you. We should all be treated the same, and just continuing to try to think in that vein and seeing that we've been trying to use that same flawed logic for 200 years, maybe even more. And it plays right into the hands of white people maintaining their system of terrorism over us, as long as we keep trying to think of them in some other terms. And it's just obvious that's just not the way that they function, particularly in relation to us. Nothing could be further from the truth. I would say it's rhetorical ethic, but this is coming from, I guess that is the function of rhetorical ethic. Dr. Arnie talks about that. They say these lofty things that they know are not true. They know it's total deception, and we pick it up as truth and think, oh yeah, white people, they believe in humanity. They believe in justice. They believe in civilization. They want to do the right thing, and that is not true at all. More evidence to come. Any final thoughts folks want to get in before we get to the next two chapters?
Oh, just one thing, and that was, there was one scene in the movie, and it does kind of give it away that these guys are up to something, and McQueen paints it like that. It's when they're at the table and they're pouring the wine. One of the gentlemen kind of rolls his eyes and he's saying to the other one, hey, just hurry up and get this over with. And you see them pour Solomon Northrup a full glass. His glass is full to the rim. Theirs are kind of down, at the level. And I think that's probably the only visual giveaway you'll get in the movie.
I have one question. The two kids of Elijah, one son and one daughter, and the daughter was mixed. What was the difference in their ages? Did the son come first and then the daughter?
Yes, it was the son, then the daughter.
Yes, he was 10, and the daughter, he said, was
about 7.
7. She said 6 or 7.
Okay, thank you.
I have one thing I noticed when I was looking for context for the book. They brought up the question. I had always known that the Civil War was fought for the issue of slavery, but I didn't realize the laws, or at least it didn't stick with me, that the same anti-slavery laws were being passed in England, in Britain, in 1772, and they were worried, the colonists were worried that those anti-slavery laws were going to affect them, and that was a big impetus for the American Revolution. And I was surprised because I remember reading this book called Britain, the Slaves, and the American Revolution. And it said as much a long time ago, but until now I never put the two together. But, I didn't know if anyone else, if that was kind of a new revelation for anyone else, that a very big part of the American Revolution was the issue of slavery, anti-slavery legislation coming out of England.
Biggest business operation on the planet continues to be enslavement of non-white people worldwide. Anything else? Next two chapters, anything else? Last sentence. Right on. Wow, grandfather clock. How about that? We will get to next two chapters. If you can mute your line, that would be grand. If you are not able to do so, I can mute it for you, and then I'll just unmute everybody once the second audio segment concludes. Should be about 30 minutes, so we should have ample time for dialogue once the section ends. If you had comments and you didn't get to participate before now, just write them down, make a little note to yourself, and we'll be sure to get you. If you haven't participated and you dial in and put your hand up, I'll make sure that you're the first person to go once we get back. If you're on the line and you forgot, as I said, just make a note, and we'll be sure we should have ample time to share once this segment concludes. Context of White Supremacy, segment number 2, Solomon Northrup, 12 Years a Slave.
Chapter 4. At intervals during the first night of Eliza's incarceration in the pen, she complained bitterly of Jacob Brooks, her young mistress's husband. She declared that had she been aware of the deception he intended to practice upon her, he never would have brought her there alive. They had chosen the opportunity of getting her away when Master Barry was absent from the plantation. He had always been kind to her. She wished that she could see him, but she knew that even he was unable now to rescue her. Then would she commence weeping again, kissing the sleeping children, talking first to one, then to the other, as they lay in their unconscious slumbers with their heads upon her lap. So wore the long night away. And when the morning dawned, and night had come again, still she kept mourning on, and would not be consoled. About midnight following, the cell door opened, and Birch and Radburn entered with lanterns in their hands. Birch, with an oath, ordered us to roll up our blankets without delay and get ready to go on board the boat. He swore we would be left unless we hurried fast. He aroused the children from their slumbers with a rough shake and said they were damned sleepy, it appeared. Going out into the yard, he called Clem Ray, ordering him to leave the loft and come into the cell and bring his blanket with him. When Clem appeared, he placed us side by side and fastened us together with handcuffs, my left hand to his right. John Williams had been taken out a day or two before, his master having redeemed him, greatly to his delight. Clem and I were ordered to march, Eliza and the children following. We were conducted into the yard, from thence into the covered passage, and up a flight of steps through a side door into the upper room, where I had heard the walking to and fro. Its furniture was a stove, a few old chairs, and a long table covered with papers. It was a whitewashed room, without any carpet on the floor, and seemed a sort of office. By one of the windows, I remember, hung a rusty sword, which attracted my attention. Birch's trunk was there. In obedience to his orders, I took hold of one of its handles with my unfettered hand, while he, taking hold of the other, we proceeded out of the front door into the street in the same order as we had left the cell. It was a dark night. All was quiet. I could see lights, or the reflection of them, over towards Pennsylvania Avenue, but there was no one, not even a straggler, to be seen. I was almost resolved to attempt to break away. Had I not been handcuffed, the attempt would certainly have been made, whatever consequence might have followed. Radburn was in the rear carrying a large stick, and hurrying up the children as fast as the little ones could walk. So we passed, handcuffed and in silence, through the streets of Washington, through the capital of a nation whose theory of government, we are told, rests on the foundation of man's inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Hail, Columbia, happy land indeed. Reaching the steamboat, we were quickly hustled into the hold, among barrels and boxes of freight. A colored servant brought a light, the bell rung, and soon the vessel started down the Potomac, carrying us we knew not where. The bell tolled as we passed the tomb of Washington. Birch, no doubt, with uncovered head, bowed reverently before the sacred ashes of the man who devoted his illustrious life to the liberty of his country. None of us slept that night but Randall and little Emmy. For the first time, Clem Ray was wholly overcome. To him, the idea of going south was terrible in the extreme. He was leaving the friends and associations of his youth, everything that was dear and precious to his heart, in all probability, never to return. He and Eliza mingled their tears together, bemoaning their cruel fate. For my own part, difficult as it was, I endeavored to keep up my spirits. I resolved in my mind 100 plans of escape, and fully determined to make the attempt the first desperate chance that offered. I had by this time become satisfied, however, that my true policy was to say nothing further on the subject of my having been born a freeman. It would but expose me to maltreatment and diminish the chances of liberation. After sunrise in the morning we were called up on deck to breakfast. Birch took our handcuffs off, and we sat down to table. He asked Eliza if she would take a dram. She declined, thanking him politely. During the meal we were all silent. Not a word passed between us. A mulatto woman who served at table seemed to take an interest in our behalf, told us to cheer up, and not to be so cast down. Breakfast over, the handcuffs were restored, and Birch ordered us out on the stern deck. We sat down together on some boxes, still saying nothing in Birch's presence. Occasionally a passenger would walk out to where we were, look at us for a while, then silently return. It was a very pleasant morning. The fields along the river were covered with verdure, far in advance of what I had been accustomed to see at that season of the year. The sun shone out warmly. The birds were singing in the trees. The happy birds! I envied them. I wished for wings like them, that I might cleave the air to where my birdlings waited vainly for their father's coming, in the cooler region of the north. In the forenoon the steamer reached Aquia Creek. There the passengers took stages, Birch and his 5 slaves occupying one exclusively. He laughed with the children, and at one stopping place went so far as to purchase them a piece of gingerbread. He told me to hold up my head and look smart, that I might, perhaps, get a good master if I behaved myself. I made him no reply. His face was hateful to me, and I could not bear to look upon it. I sat in the corner, cherishing in my heart the hope, not yet extinct, of some day meeting the tyrant on the soil of my native state. At Fredericksburg we were transferred from the stagecoach to a car, and before dark arrived in Richmond, the chief city of Virginia. At this city we were taken from the cars and driven through the street to a slave pen, between the railroad depot and the river, kept by a Mr. Gooden. This pen is similar to Williams in Washington, except it is somewhat larger. And besides, there were 2 small houses standing at opposite corners within the yard. These houses are usually found within slave yards, being used as rooms for the examination of human chattels by purchasers before concluding a bargain. Unsoundness in a slave, as well as in a horse, detracts materially from his value. If no warranty is given, a close examination is a matter of particular importance to the Negro jockey. We were met at the door of Gooden's yard by that gentleman himself, a short, fat man with a round, plump face, black hair and whiskers, and a complexion almost as dark as some of his own Negroes. He had a hard, stern look, and was perhaps about 50 years of age. Birch and he met with great cordiality. They were evidently old friends. Shaking each other warmly by the hand, Birch remarked he had brought some company, inquired at what time the brig would leave, and was answered that it would probably leave the next day at such an hour. Gooden then turned to me, took hold of my arm, turned me partly round, looked at me sharply with the air of one who considered himself a good judge of property, and as if estimating in his own mind about how much I was worth. "Well, boy, where did you come from?" Forgetting myself for a moment, I answered, "From New York." "New York? Hell, what have you been doing up there?" was his astonished interrogatory. Observing Birch at this moment looking at me with an angry expression that conveyed a meaning it was not difficult to understand, I immediately said, "Oh, I have only been up that way a piece," in a manner intended to imply that although I might have been as far as New York, yet I wished it distinctly understood that I did not belong to that free state, nor to any other. Gooden then turned to Clem, and then to Eliza and the children, examining them severally, and asking various questions. He was pleased with Emily, as was everyone who saw the child's sweet countenance. She was not as tidy as when I first beheld her. Her hair was now somewhat disheveled, but through its unkempt and soft profusion there still beamed a little face of most surpassing loveliness. "Altogether we were a fair lot, a devilish good lot," he said, enforcing that opinion with more than one emphatic adjective not found in the Christian vocabulary. Thereupon we passed into the yard. Quite a number of slaves, as many as 30, I should say, were moving about or sitting on benches under the shed. They were all cleanly dressed, the men with hats, the women with handkerchiefs tied about their heads. Birch and Gooden, after separating from us, walked up the steps at the back part of the main building and sat down upon the door-sill. They entered into conversation, but the subject of it I could not hear. Presently Birch came down into the yard, unfettered me, and led me into one of the small houses. "You told that man you came from New York," said he. I replied, "I told him I had been up as far as New York, to be sure, but did not tell him I belonged there, nor that I was a freeman. I meant no harm at all, Master Birch. I would not have said it, had I thought." He looked at me a moment as if he was ready to devour me, then turning round went out. In a few minutes he returned. "If ever I hear you say a word about New York or about your freedom, I will be the death of you. I will kill you. You may rely on that," he ejaculated fiercely. I doubt not he understood then better than I did the danger and the penalty of selling a free man into slavery. He felt the necessity of closing my mouth against the crime he knew he was committing. Of course, my life would not have weighed a feather in any emergency requiring such a sacrifice. Undoubtedly, he meant precisely what he said. Under the shed on one side of the yard there was constructed a rough table, while overhead were sleeping lofts, the same as in the pen at Washington. After partaking at this table of our supper of pork and bread, I was handcuffed to a large yellow man, quite stout and fleshy, with a countenance expressive of the utmost melancholy. He was a man of intelligence and information. Chained together, it was not long before we became acquainted with each other's history. His name was Robert. Like myself, he had been born free, and had a wife and 2 children in Cincinnati. He said he had come south with 2 men who had hired him in the city of his residence. Without free papers, he had been seized at Fredericksburg, placed in confinement, and beaten until he had learned, as I had, the necessity and the policy of silence. He had been in Gooden's pen about 3 weeks. To this man I became much attached. We could sympathize with and understand each other. It was with tears and a heavy heart, not many days subsequently, that I saw him die, and looked for the last time upon his lifeless form. Robert and myself, with Clem, Eliza, and her children, slept that night upon our blankets in one of the small houses in the yard. There were 4 others, all from the same plantation, who had been sold and were now on their way south, who also occupied it with us. David and his wife, Caroline, both mulattoes, were exceedingly affected. They dreaded the thought of being put into the cane and cotton fields, but their greatest source of anxiety was the apprehension of being separated. Mary, a tall, lithe girl, of a most jetty black, was listless and apparently indifferent. Like many of the class, she scarcely knew there was such a word as freedom. Brought up in the ignorance of a brute, she possessed but little more than a brute's intelligence. She was one of those, and there are very many, who fear nothing but their master's lash, and know no further duty than to obey his voice. The other was Lethe. She was of an entirely different character. She had long, straight hair, and bore more the appearance of an Indian than a Negro woman. She had sharp and spiteful eyes, and continually gave utterance to the language of hatred and revenge. Her husband had been sold. She knew not where she was. An exchange of masters, she was sure, could not be for the worse. She cared not whither they might carry her. Pointing to the scars upon her face, the desperate creature wished that she might see the day when she could wipe them off in some man's blood. While we were thus learning the history of each other's wretchedness, Eliza was seated in a corner by herself, singing hymns and praying for her children. Wearied from the loss of so much sleep, I could no longer bear up against the advances of that sweet restorer, and laying down by the side of Robert on the floor, soon forgot my troubles, and slept until the dawn of day. In the morning, having swept the yard and washed ourselves under Gooden's superintendence, we were ordered to roll up our blankets and make ready for the continuance of our journey. Clem Ray was informed that he would go no further, Birch, for some cause, having concluded to carry him back to Washington. He was much rejoiced. Shaking hands, we parted in the slave pen at Richmond, and I have not seen him since. But, much to my surprise, since my return, I learned that he had escaped from bondage, and on his way to the free soil of Canada, lodged one night at the house of my brother-in-law in Saratoga, informing my family of the place and the condition in which he left me. In the afternoon we were drawn up, two abreast, Robert and myself in advance, and in this order driven by Birch and Gooden from the yard, through the streets of Richmond, to the brig Orleans. She was a vessel of respectable size, full-rigged, and freighted principally with tobacco. We were all on board by 5 o'clock. Birch brought us each a tin cup and a spoon. There were 40 of us in the brig, being all, except Clem, that were in the pen. With a small pocket-knife that had not been taken from me, I began cutting the initials of my name upon the tin cup. The others immediately flocked round me, requesting me to mark theirs in a similar manner. In time I gratified them all, of which they did not appear to be forgetful. We were all stowed away in the hold at night, and the hatch barred down. We laid on boxes, or wherever there was room enough to stretch our blankets on the floor. Birch accompanied us no farther than Richmond, returning from that point to the capital with Clem. Not until the lapse of almost 12 years, to wit, in January last, in the Washington police office, did I set my eyes upon his face again. James H. Birch was a slave trader, buying men, women, and children at low prices, and selling them at an advance. He was a speculator in human flesh, a disreputable calling, and so considered at the South. For the present he disappears from the scenes recorded in this narrative, but he will appear again before its close, not in the character of a man-whipping tyrant, but as an arrested, cringing criminal in a court of law that failed to do him justice. Chapter 5. After we were all on board, the brig Orleans proceeded down James River. Passing into Chesapeake Bay, we arrived next day opposite the city of Norfolk. While lying at anchor, a lighter approached us from the town, bringing 4 more slaves. Frederick, a boy of 18, had been born a slave, as also had Henry, who was some years older. They had both been house servants in the city. Maria was a rather genteel-looking colored girl with a faultless form, but ignorant and extremely vain. The idea of going to New Orleans was pleasing to her. She entertained an extravagantly high opinion of her own attractions. Assuming a haughty mien, she declared to her companions that immediately on our arrival in New Orleans she had no doubt some wealthy single gentleman of good taste would purchase her at once. But the most prominent of the 4 was a man named Arthur. As the lighter approached, he struggled stoutly with his keepers. It was with main force that he was dragged aboard the brig. He protested in a loud voice against the treatment he was receiving and demanded to be released. His face was swollen and covered with wounds and bruises, and indeed one side of it was a complete raw sore. He was forced, with all haste, down the hatchway into the hold. I caught an outline of his story as he was born struggling along, of which he afterwards gave me a more full relation, and it was as follows. He had long resided in the city of Norfolk, and was a free man. He had a family living there, and was a mason by trade. Having been unusually detained, he was returning late one night to his house in the suburbs of the city when he was attacked by a gang of persons in an unfrequented street. He fought until his strength failed him. Overpowered at last, he was gagged and bound with ropes, and beaten until he became insensible. For several days they secreted him in the slave pen at Norfolk, a very common establishment, it appears, in the cities of the South. The night before, he had been taken out and put on board the lighter, which, pushing out from shore, had awaited our arrival. For some time he continued his protestations, and was altogether irreconcilable. At length, however, he became silent. He sank into a gloomy and thoughtful mood, and appeared to be counseling with himself. There was in the man's determined face something that suggested the thought of desperation. After leaving Norfolk, the handcuffs were taken off, and during the day we were allowed to remain on deck. The captain selected Robert as his waiter, and I was appointed to superintend the cooking department, and the distribution of food and water. I had 3 assistants, Jim, Cuffy, and Jenny. Jenny's business was to prepare the coffee, which consisted of cornmeal scorched in a kettle, boiled and sweetened with molasses. Jim and Cuffy baked the hoe cake and boiled the bacon. Standing by a table formed of a wide board resting on the heads of the barrels, I cut and handed to each a slice of meat and a dodger of the bread, and from Jenny's kettle also dipped out for each a cup of the coffee. The use of plates was dispensed with, and their sable fingers took the place of knives and forks. Jim and Cuffy were very demure and attentive to business, somewhat inflated with their situation as second cooks, and without doubt feeling that there was a great responsibility resting on them. I was called steward, a name given me by the captain. The slaves were fed twice a day, at 10 and 5 o'clock, always receiving the same kind and quantity of fare, and in the same manner as described above. At night we were driven into the hold and securely fastened down. Scarcely were we out of sight of land before we were overtaken by a violent storm. The brig rolled and plunged until we feared she would go down. Some were seasick, others on their knees praying, while some were fast holding to each other, paralyzed with fear. The seasickness rendered the place of our confinement loathsome and disgusting. It would have been a happy thing for most of us. It would have saved the agony of many hundred lashes and miserable deaths at last, had the compassionate sea snatched us that day from the clutches of remorseless men. The thought of Randall and little Emmy sinking down among the monsters of the deep is a more pleasant contemplation than to think of them as they are now, perhaps dragging out lives of unrequited toil. When in sight of the Bahama banks, at a place called Old Point Compass, or the Hole in the Wall, we were becalmed 3 days. There was scarcely a breath of air. The waters of the Gulf presented a singularly white appearance, like lime water. In the order of events, I come now to the relation of an occurrence which I never call to mind but with sensations of regret. I thank God, who has since permitted me to escape from the thraldom of slavery, that through his merciful interposition I was prevented from imbruing my hands in the blood of his creatures. Let not those who have never been placed in like circumstances judge me harshly. Until they have been chained and beaten, until they find themselves in the situation I was, borne away from home and family towards a land of bondage, let them refrain from saying what they would not do for liberty. How far I should have been justified in the sight of God and man, it is unnecessary now to speculate upon. It is enough to say that I am able to congratulate myself upon the harmless termination of an affair which threatened, for a time, to be attended with serious results. Towards evening, on the first day of the calm, Arthur and myself were in the bow of the vessel, seated on the windlass. We were conversing together of the probable destiny that awaited us, and mourning together over our misfortunes. Arthur said, and I agreed with him, that death was far less terrible than the living prospect that was before us. For a long time we talked of our children, our past lives, and of the probabilities of escape. Obtaining possession of the brig was suggested by one of us. We discussed the possibility of our being able, in such an event, to make our way to the harbor of New York. I knew little of the compass. But the idea of risking the experiment was eagerly entertained. The chances, for and against us, in an encounter with the crew was canvassed. Who could be relied upon, and who could not? The proper time and manner of the attack were all talked over and over again. From the moment the plot suggested itself, I began to hope. I revolved it constantly in my mind. As difficulty after difficulty arose, some ready conceit was at hand, demonstrating how it could be overcome. While others slept, Arthur and I were maturing our plans. At length, with much caution, Robert was gradually made acquainted with our intentions. He approved of them at once, and entered into the conspiracy with a zealous spirit. There was not another slave we dared to trust. Brought up in fear and ignorance as they are, it can scarcely be conceived how servilely they will cringe before a white man's look. It was not safe to deposit so bold a secret with any of them, and finally we three resolved to take upon ourselves alone the fearful responsibility of the attempt. At night, as has been said, we were driven into the hold, and the hatch barred down. How to reach the deck was the first difficulty that presented itself. On the bow of the brig, however, I had observed the small boat lying bottom upwards. It occurred to me that by secreting ourselves underneath it, we would not be missed from the crowd as they were hurried down into the hold at night. I was selected to make the experiment in order to satisfy ourselves of its feasibility. The next evening, accordingly, after supper, watching my opportunity, I hastily concealed myself beneath it. Lying close upon the deck, I could see what was going on around me, while wholly unperceived myself. In the morning, as they came up, I slipped from my hiding place without being observed. The result was entirely satisfactory. The captain and mate slept in the cabin of the former. From Robert, who had frequent occasion, in his capacity of waiter, to make observations in that quarter, we ascertained the exact position of their respective berths. He further informed us that there were always 2 pistols and a cutlass lying on the table. The crew's cook slept in the cook galley on deck, a sort of vehicle on wheels that could be moved about as convenience required, while the sailors, numbering only 6, either slept in the forecastle or in hammocks swung among the rigging. Finally, our arrangements were all completed. Arthur and I were to steal silently to the captain's cabin, seize the pistols and cutlass, and as quickly as possible dispatch him and the mate. Robert, with a club, was to stand by the door leading from the deck down into the cabin, and, in case of necessity, beat back the sailors until we could hurry to his assistance. We were to proceed then as circumstances might require. Should the attack be so sudden and successful as to prevent resistance, the hatch was to remain barred down. Otherwise the slaves were to be called up, and in the crowd and hurry and confusion of the time, we resolved to regain our liberty or lose our lives. I was then to assume the unaccustomed place of pilot, and, steering northward, we trusted that some lucky wind might bear us to the soil of freedom. The mate's name was Biddy. The captain's I cannot now recall, though I rarely ever forget a name once heard. The captain was a small, genteel man, erect and prompt, with a proud bearing, and looked the personification of courage. If he is still living, and these pages should chance to meet his eye, he will learn a fact connected with the voyage of the brig from Richmond to New Orleans in 1841, not entered on his logbook. We were all prepared, and impatiently waiting an opportunity of putting our designs into execution, when they were frustrated by a sad and unforeseen event. Robert was taken ill. It was soon announced that he had the smallpox. He continued to grow worse, and 4 days previous to our arrival in New Orleans, he died. One of the sailors sewed him in his blanket with a large stone from the ballast at his feet, and then, laying him on a hatchway and elevating it with tackles above the railing, the inanimate body of poor Robert was consigned to the white waters of the Gulf. We were all panic-stricken by the appearance of the smallpox. The captain ordered lime to be scattered throughout the hold, and other prudent precautions to be taken. The death of Robert, however, and the presence of the malady oppressed me sadly, and I gazed out over the great waste of waters with a spirit that was indeed disconsolate. An evening or two after Robert's burial, I was leaning on the hatchway near the forecastle, full of desponding thoughts, when a sailor in a kind voice asked me why I was so downhearted. The tone and manner of the man assured me, and I answered because I was a freeman, and had been kidnapped. He remarked that it was enough to make anyone downhearted, and continued to interrogate me until he learned the particulars of my whole history. He was evidently much interested in my behalf, and in the blunt speech of a sailor, swore he would aid me all he could if it split his timbers. I requested him to furnish me pen, ink, and paper, in order that I might write to some of my friends. He promised to obtain them, but how I could use them undiscovered was a difficulty. If I could only get into the forecastle while his watch was off, and the other sailors asleep, the thing could be accomplished. The small boat instantly occurred to me. He thought we were not far from the Balize, at the mouth of the Mississippi, and it was necessary that the letter be written soon, or the opportunity would be lost. Accordingly, by arrangement, I managed the next night to secret myself again under the longboat. His watch was off at 12. I saw him pass into the forecastle, and in about an hour followed him. He was nodding over a table, half asleep, on which a sickly light was flickering, and on which also was a pen and sheet of paper. As I entered, he aroused, beckoned me to a seat beside him, and pointed to the paper. I directed the letter to Henry B. Northrup of Sandy Hill, stating that I had been kidnapped, was then on board the brig Orleans, bound for New Orleans. That it was then impossible for me to conjecture my ultimate destination, and requesting he would take measures to rescue me. The letter was sealed and directed, and Manning, having read it, promised to deposit it in the New Orleans post office. I hastened back to my place under the longboat, and in the morning, as the slaves came up and were walking round, crept out unnoticed and mingled with them. My good friend, whose name was John Manning, was an Englishman by birth, and a noble-hearted, generous sailor as ever walked a deck. He had lived in Boston, was a tall, well-built man, about 24 years old, with a face somewhat pock-marked, but full of benevolent expression. Nothing to vary the monotony of our daily life occurred until we reached New Orleans. On coming to the levee, and before the vessel was made fast, I saw Manning leap on shore and hurry away into the city. As he started off, he looked back over his shoulder significantly, giving me to understand the object of his errand. Presently he returned, and passing close by me, hunched me with his elbow, with a peculiar wink, as much as to say, "It is all right." The letter, as I have since learned, reached Sandy Hill. Mr. Northrup visited Albany and laid it before Governor Seward, but inasmuch as it gave no definite information as to my probable locality, it was not, at that time, deemed advisable to institute measures for my liberation. It was concluded to delay, trusting that a knowledge of where I was might eventually be obtained. A happy and touching scene was witnessed immediately upon our reaching the levee. Just as Manning left the brig on his way to the post office, two men came up and called aloud for Arthur. The latter, as he recognized them, was almost crazy with delight. He could hardly be restrained from leaping over the brig's side, and when they met soon after, he grasped them by the hand and clung to them a long, long time. They were men from Norfolk, who had come on to New Orleans to rescue him. His kidnappers, they informed him, had been arrested, and were then confined in the Norfolk prison. They conversed a few moments with the captain, and then departed with the rejoicing Arthur. But in all the crowd that thronged the wharf, there was no one who knew or cared for me. Not one. No familiar voice greeted my ears, nor was there a single face that I had ever seen. Soon Arthur would rejoin his family, and have the satisfaction of seeing his wrongs avenged. My family, alas, should I ever see them more? There was a feeling of utter desolation in my heart, filling it with a despairing and regretful sense that I had not gone down with Robert to the bottom of the sea. Very soon traders and consignees came on board. One, a tall, thin-faced man with light complexion and a little bent, made his appearance with a paper in his hand. Birch's gang, consisting of myself, Eliza and her children, Harry, Lethe, and some others, who had joined us at Richmond, were consigned to him. This gentleman was Mr. Theophilus Freeman. Reading from his paper, he called Platt. No one answered. The name was called again and again, but still there was no reply. Then Lethe was called, then Eliza, then Harry, until the list was finished, each one stepping forward as his or her name was called. "Captain, where's Platt?" demanded Theophilus Freeman. The captain was unable to inform him, no one being on board answering to that name. "Who shipped that nigger?" he again inquired of the captain, pointing to me. "Birch," replied the captain. "Your name is Platt. You answer my description. Why don't you come forward?" he demanded of me in an angry tone. I informed him that was not my name, that I had never been called by it, but that I had no objection to it as I knew of. "Well, I will learn you your name," said he, "and so you won't forget it either," he added. Mr. Theophilus Freeman, by the way, was not a whit behind his partner, Birch, in the matter of blasphemy. On the vessel I had gone by the name of Stewart, and this was the first time I had ever been designated as Platt, the name forwarded by Birch to his consignee. From the vessel I observed the chain gang at work on the levee. We passed near them as we were driven to Freeman's slave pen. This pen is very similar to Gooden's in Richmond, except the yard was enclosed by plank, standing upright with ends sharpened instead of brick walls. Including us, there were now at least 50 in this pen. Depositing our blankets in one of the small buildings in the yard, and having been called up and fed, we were allowed to saunter about the enclosure until night, when we wrapped our blankets round us and laid down under the shed, or in the loft, or in the open yard, just as each one preferred. It was but a short time I closed my eyes that night. Thought was busy in my brain. Could it be possible that I was thousands of miles from home, that I had been driven through the streets like a dumb beast, that I had been chained and beaten without mercy, that I was even then herded with a drove of slaves, a slave myself? Were the events of the last few weeks realities indeed, or was I passing only through the dismal phases of a long protracted dream? It was no illusion. My cup of sorrow was full to overflowing. Then I lifted up my hands to God, and in the still watches of the night, surrounded by the sleeping forms of my companions, begged for mercy on the poor forsaken captive. To the Almighty Father of us all, the freeman and the slave, I poured forth the supplications of a broken spirit, imploring strength from on high to bear up against the burden of my troubles, until the morning light aroused the slumberers, ushering in another day of bondage.
Context of White Supremacy. This is a right interesting book. I think for folks who have not read it, as we continue on, you will see why it's been made into a movie twice. Even though it's not that long, we are about a quarter of the way through. I was thinking we'll be done early December. We might be done. It might only take us the month of November. At any rate, it's not going to be too many more of these. So pay attention. Be ready to roll next week. For folks who would like to chime in, if you have commentary, the number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. The number one more time is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. For folks, if you are on the line, just watch the background noise. I know some folks seem to have very nice grandfather clocks and other things. Just be mindful. We can't hear all that. If you're doing a lot of shifting and adjusting, we can hear all that with the phone as well. There was one quick passage that I wanted to read from the first portion of the audio segment, and then we can go ahead and move forward to any thoughts people might have that we just heard from the second audio segment. Let's see here. This is, again, I have the ebook, so my pages won't really correspond. But Mr. Northrup, he writes, having all my life breathed the free air of the North, and conscious that I possessed the same feelings and affections that find a place in the white man's breast, conscious, moreover, of an intelligence equal to that of some men, at least with a fairer skin, I was too ignorant, perhaps too independent, to conceive how anyone could be content to live in the abject condition of a slave. I could not comprehend the justice of that law or that religion which upholds or recognizes the principle of slavery, and never once, I am proud to say, did I fail to counsel anyone who came to me to watch his opportunity and strike for freedom. Great passage. I don't know how that would be inserted in the film, but I just thought that was a great passage. And it even reminds me, because I feel like I hear a lot of victims talk about how they would respond if they were in the formal enslavement, if they were on, obvious explicit plantation, what they would do, how they would respond. I wouldn't put up with that. I think that's even in the skit that we had from Miss A.Z. Dungy when she was on talking about Ask a Slave, where she had the one black male who was talking about, there's no way I would lay down for all that. That is remarkable to have someone who actually was born, quote unquote, free, stolen, placed in formal slavery, and did actually have that and did everything that they could to get out. And even particularly in the second audio segment, hearing on this slave ship, him working with some of the other enslaved black people to try to see if they could figure out a way to mutiny on the ship. It is a remarkable book, man. The folks that might have thoughts they would like to share, your lines are all open. That would be 404 Mr. Demery 4, the caller at 1922, and caller at 7537. Your lines are all open. I'll get other hands as I see them.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I have three observations that were talked about in the last two chapters. One was when he discussed about not saying that he was free and that he made the decision to keep quiet about that. I found that interesting, even though later on when asked about where he was from, he immediately said New York. And I guess that he probably didn't really believe that, or he just like he said, he just wasn't thinking. And my second observation was the use of color and the use of physical descriptions when he talked about people. I found that interesting because for those people that were lighter skinned, to me at least, he had very positive physical descriptions, and for the white people, it would go back and forth between positive or negative physical descriptions, and I found that interesting. And the fact that he still had some sort of trust with white people, even though in the end the person did indeed deliver his letter, he still trusted the white people to do what they said that they were going to do. And my third and last observation was that in the chapter he discussed about the large yellow man. It seemed that he was saying that black life wasn't worthless. Wasn't worth anything. And I don't know, it was interesting that he stated that. And that's all I have right now.
Okay. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because that was one of the things that I was going to come up with, which is why I'm leaning to believe that this book was written by someone, a white person. that the description of the people as is put forth and this narration by this white person, it is really going to get on my nerves as this progresses. Because, as you said, Gus, with this good cop, bad cop situation, it showed where these two black people who were so-called redeemed and who were so grateful to these white people for rescuing them from being sold down south, even though they're exchanging one bad circumstance for maybe something not as bad. And this black woman who they said had this spiteful look in her face, because what is she supposed to feel? Look what they did to her husband. They sold her away from her husband. Her husband was dead, and she wanted blood. She was saying she did not care what she had to do. She was going to take some of them with her as she leave out of this life. And I was so grateful for that part in the book, because it showed that she was going to go down fighting. She was not going to accept this lot in life, and she was not a defeated person. The only thing is with the movie, it took some liberties with the guy who died from a smallpox. It deviated from the script a little bit and did not show him dying from a smallpox in the movie. They came up with their own creative circumstance as a rebellion, and he was about to enact it, and then he was killed, and then he was tossed overboard as, you know, after he was stabbed to death by the captain or whomever, and then he was, Northrup and the other guy just blanketed him up and tossed him overboard as they normally would do at sea burial. But the description, yes, that is why I am saying it had to have been written by someone white, wrote this book, because the description does not fall into how black people, I'm thinking, spoke of in those times, and I would describe these people who's a mulatto, who's a quadroon, who's a yellow person, a dark person with Indian features. All of these different descriptions, it is not sitting well with me. So I don't know if anyone else has picked up on that, and I'll just mute myself and let others get a chance.
Well, with that, what you just said about the woman who was upset and who would do pretty much anything to kill white people, it would seem to me that she would probably have been suitable for the rebellion. But for whatever reasons that the author put, he and the others decided against telling anybody else. Mm-hmm. But it seemed like she would be probably even more suitable to help with their rebellion.
Exactly. But she was left out of the plot. They got these three other guys, and, you know, one of them seriously died of smallpox. And, you know, and then this religion and religion at the end, and praying to God, and, oh, Lord.
Yeah.
This is going to be hard. This is going to be real hard with this praying.
Yeah.
The other two folks that are on the line, did y'all have anything you wanted to get in as well? Let's see.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay. First, I'd like to say that at the beginning of the book, in the editor's preface, it was saying that the editor, with the collaboration with Mr. Solomon Northrup, he did write the book, so his name was David Wilson. So I presume he's a white man. So that's probably the influence that 404 has noticed in the book. But a lot of the places that he was describing, you know, I have seen a slave pen in Alexandria, and the way those buildings were made, it's almost exactly the way this is described. Because in front, you can't tell that it was once an auction house. But in the back, you can see where they kept the enslaved people. But anyway, I think that it's interesting that because of the circumstances, the different enslaved individuals had different attitudes. And depending on what your situation was upon the time of your capture, determine what your attitude was towards your captivity. In other words, some of the people who may have had it better may have been mistresses for the women, kind of had an idea that everywhere they went, they would have that same type of experience. Like the one young lady thought that once she got to New Orleans, some rich man would purchase her and she would continue on to live the way she was living before. And some of the guys had never experienced slavery, so they had no way to imagine what would happen. But I thought it was interesting that they were trying to escape and that they had a plan together. If it hadn't been for the incident where Robert took ill, then it may have been a mutiny. But I'll mute my line, give somebody else a chance. Thanks.
Was one other caller on with us. Did you have something you wanted to get in? The one caller line should be open. If you're just listening, that's fine too. Just making sure that we didn't miss anybody. Or looks like now it's 5. If there's anybody, caller from a block number, if there's anybody on the line who has not spoken yet, if you have anything you would like to share, your line should be open. And then we had one other person that just dialed in. Your line should be open too. Everybody that called in with a hand up, your line should be open.
I just wanted to add to it. It does seem kind of suspicious that or that it could be that somebody else wrote the book. But then again, with what the brother was saying, if there was a white man involved, no doubt the quadroon and all of the other descriptions that they use for non-white people, he would have definitely been using those. But I wanted to add to it that the name Gooden that they used there in Richmond was a family name of some white people that I grew up with in North Carolina, and we were just below the Virginia border, probably about, I'm going to say, maybe 2.5, 3 hours from Richmond. So as far as authenticity, what those pens look like in Alexandria, the last name of the slave family, there's also some slave plantations there where I grew up at, and there's a similarity to the one in Virginia. So the authenticity of it is there, but I think some of the language was probably influenced, and that's all.
I agree, because I have a friend of mine from South Carolina who are Gooden, but they spell it with the E-N, G-O-O-D-E-N, and they're black. But and the way how you describe this Gooden person and these so-called Jewish people who call themselves as Jew, I know coming from the East Coast that is a Jewish name. And then they mentioned a guy, Freeman, in New Orleans, who is also a so-called, quote, I put this in quotes, Jewish person involved in the so-called bartering and selling, because Virginia and the Carolinas were really big with the Jews having, these so-called Jews having hands in the slave business and the bartering and the selling of black people back and forth. And I know from New Orleans being up there, there is a real, you can see a lot of areas up there where the slave pens, and as you said, a description of the place. If you get a chance to go there, you can see, as you said, looking at it from the front, you really can't tell what's going on until you get to the back, and then you can see really and truly that's, the house of horrors that's in the back there.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that's something that's kind of important to keep in mind. I won't say much, but if you can think another autobiography, Minister Malcolm, his autobiography was told to Alex Haley. This book being told, I think it's David Wilson, is probably a white guy who wrote this book, was told by Solomon Northrup. Something to keep in mind, how that might have influenced what the final product that we have here, and the affinity that whites seem to have for this text. It was the passage where he was talking about the mutiny. It stood out to me for a lot of reasons, where he says, while others slept, Arthur and I were maturing our plans. At length, with much caution, Robert was gradually made acquainted with our intentions. He approved of them at once and entered into the conspiracy with a zealous spirit. There was not another slave we dared to trust. Brought up in fear and ignorance as they are, it can scarcely be conceived how servilely they will cringe before a white man's look. It was not safe to deposit so bold a secret with any of them, and finally we three resolved to take upon ourselves alone the fearful responsibility of the attempt. Very intriguing passage, I thought, just on the one where he got, talking about Mr. Northrup, he got in this situation in the first place for being very trusting of these random white people who drugged him and stole him away to sell him off into being enslaved. But I don't know, and I couldn't really, and I'm not even saying that I think this is inaccurate. We talk about this right now and saying you're not supposed to talk about racism on the job because non-white people, victims of racism, they might not necessarily have your back. This same sort of thing could happen today, 2013. Folks have any other thoughts on this passage and or why they did not include Lethe in their plans? That was the female victim. She was enslaved, who was, I think they described her as having kind of a spiteful look in her eyes, and she wanted to kill the white people. How it seemed like she would have been a great candidate, as you all said, to be included in the plans.
Well, from my perspective, I understood why they decided to just keep it among themselves because, as he said, they couldn't really trust anybody else. And, if you discuss, escaping, or if you discuss racism, white supremacy among other non-white people, you open yourself up to being exposed to white people. So I understood why, but as I said, Lisi, as the character's name is, I think that if I would at least try to see where she stood, because it seemed to me that if things came down to it, she would at least be willing to kill all the white people, or at least be able to do something that wasn't. She wouldn't be one of the people that will back down or tell the other person, tell the white people. Mm-hmm. At least that's my opinion.
They could have used her so much as a ploy to as a beguiler to go in there and distract the men, the sailors, because they said she was an attractive woman, even though she had this mean look in her eyes. Men, when you are in sexually aroused and you see this fine, attractive woman, they could have used her as that ploy to get them distracted while they go ahead with their plot. And she would have been the perfect candidate to get involved in it. So which is why I'm saying that it is not sitting right with me the way, as you said, it's ghost written. And they have just put themselves, and then of course this Manning character guy, the sailor that he befriended, you have one white person sold you off into slavery, and here it is as this nice white guy on this boat. He is so nice, he is, he's going to take this letter and mail it off, and then when you come back he give you the wink and the nod, oh yes, I got it done for you. I mean, you just go to seesaw emotions, you're going up and down, a good white guy, then you get a bad one, and you get another good one, then you get another bad one.
But I think that's a part of the good cop, bad cop thing that they have going on that confuses us so much. A good one, a bad one, and it keeps us, instead of looking at the whole system, looking at them individually and judging them individually, and so we never address the big picture. As far as the female slave, I think that once you completely understand what's going on, you get very angry for a long time. And as far as beguiling other people, I don't think that that's going to happen if you're very, very aware. They are going to respond to that and stay away from you. And I just don't think it's that easy to beguile people if you really understand what's just happened to you.
If you're a good actor, and knowing her circumstances and what she wanted to do to get some blood, and if she knows that all she has to do is put on a really good show, that she is really attracted to them and luring them with the ultimate goal that I'm going to slit their throats once I get them into this position, oh, we can put on a very good acting job now.
I don't know. I tried it today. And he stayed 6 weeks. He stayed 6 feet from me. I told my mother, I said, I am not getting it. And I said, if I'm going to keep living in Texas, I am going to have to change the vibe I'm putting out. I don't think it's that easy. And they sense it. I mean, creatures can sense danger.
Just hearing the description, and again, I haven't seen either film, Gordon Parks or Stephen McQueen's, but just with the amount of detail that they talking about the conditions on the slave ship, where they're getting seasick and vomiting and just all of this. Again, I mean, we haven't even gotten to some of the other ugly things that are going down in the book. I can understand why this would be appealing to whites. And you got the good white people. It's not giving you a presentation that all white people are bad. I mean, even that is phenomenal, that you got an actual white person who is on a slave ship. I am one of the seamen on the slave ship, but I am still looked at as a good white man. And he calls him his white friend. He says, that was my friend, this old Englishman. That would be two phenomenal reasons why I could see why white people would say, oh yeah, this is 8 thumbs up. Phenomenal. Oscars. This is great. Wonderful stuff here. Woohoo! The religion aspect, I've said white Jesus before. I just, tying with, you got, at least we're only 5 chapters into the book, and we've already got several good white people, friendly white people, and I suspect there will be more to come. And you've got a lot of appeals to God and religion, as I have said. I think that's white Jesus. I don't think most of the time when that message goes out, it's attached to a non-white, a black, crystal black, as Dr. Welsing says, image of the creator. I think it's attached to a white person. As I said, Kanye West, when he did I Am a God, he didn't have somebody come out on stage that looked like Mario Van Peebles or Lil Wayne or Dick Gregory or Nina Simone. He had somebody come out who looks like the same person we've all been looking at various churches and on fans and wherever else. He had some white dude come out to be white Jesus. So I think that would be 3. That's at least 3 reasons that I can think of from what we've read so far, heard so far, as to why white people would be so enamored with this. And I think just in general, white people love it, because you got a nigger in there, that would be 4, where we just get an excuse. We can let all the tacky and vile, explicit racism fly. I think there are going to be a lot of niggers thrown around as we get further into the book, and disrespect of titles. Your name is not going to be Solomon anymore. It's going to be Platt. I can see a lot of reasons why white people would enjoy this, and they love reminiscing about the good old days on the plantation.
I just have one suggestion that came out of everything you just said, Gus, and that would be for my victims of racism, white supremacy. Be careful, because white people are going to be coming out of the woodworks to discuss this with you for no other reason than they're coming out of the woodworks to talk to you about a rap song that they heard. You know, it's going to be the same old thing, and yes, they're going to the movie. White people want to see this movie simply to see the redemptive qualities of the white people that are there. So be careful. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not getting ready to get into a discussion of 12 years a slave with any white folks that I know, because that part I think is already played. That part is already played out. So therefore, there's nothing I can do to discuss it now to go back and fix it. Yeah, that's my suggestion. Not discussing the movie with white people.
Have you heard?
Yes, sir.
I wanted to know is the director Steve McQueen? Is he married to a white person?
I heard him being talked to today. I got the impression he was married to a black female, but I could be wrong. Does anybody know definitively?
No, but I'll do a search. I'll go online. But I know he's black because he said his father is from Grenada and his mother, I believe, is from Trinidad. And he grew up in England. And so I'm assuming, because he sounds real pro-black, I'm assuming that, no, he's married to a black woman, but I'll do a search. But I know the writer, John Ridley, he is a black person that wrote the script for this movie.
Oh, okay.
Because when I first heard the name Steve McQueen, I was thinking about the white guy, you know, the white actor Steve McQueen.
Yeah, me too. That's what I was thinking.
So
he was very popular back in the day, you know.
Yes. Because I know yeah.
Yeah, I thought he became a director now, you know.
Yeah, well, he's dead. I know he has a son that's named Steve McQueen also. I was thinking that maybe that was his son that was the director of this movie. I didn't know it was a black guy from England that was doing it.
Folks that are in the Minneapolis area, I know we have listeners out there. Mr. McQueen is coming to Minneapolis to do a Q&A on 12 Years a Slave, so you can make that one of your cues. Are you married to a white person? Non-white person?
I heard him on the Smiley and West radio show, and when they were interviewing him, and they had some really tough questions for him, you know, and also from what I learned from the interview, he's trying to get this book to be in schools all over the world, because he wants this book to be in the curriculum of every school in America and in Europe as well, just like they do for that book called Anne Frank, Diary of Anne Frank. He wants the same kind of level of distribution for this book as well.
I heard that. I heard that interview. I almost used some of it to start the program today, but I thought that would work anytime in the segment. You'll hear some of it as we move along with the book, but I went with the clip that we had because, number one, that was fresh, like that was just from yesterday, and it coincided nicely with the beginning of the book, like what they touched on in the audio clip about the truthfulness, the accuracy that the slave pens were that close to the Capitol, and what they call irony, but I appreciated them being honest that enslaving black people was fundamental to what they have done in this here area of the world. That is what they're about with regards to governing, politics, law, everything. It centers around terrorizing, dominating black people, non-white people, and it looks like, unfortunately, Mr. McQueen, white spouse, unfortunately.
I kind of figured that. But I also heard that he had a very difficult time getting this movie made, but he just wouldn't quit. You know, that's what I heard from the interview from Smiley and West, and that he was just so determined to get this film made. But I also feel that because he has made some great films, produced some great films in the past, I think they kind of, Hollywood gave him a pass and, letting him get this film made, you know.
Darn. You said he has a white spouse?
Her name is Bianca Stigter, or Stigter, Stigter. How do you pronounce Stigter? Bianca Stigter.
Sounds German. Well, to be expected there in England, so I'm glad to see Idris Elba, at least his girlfriend is a black female. But it's a loss, another loss to the black team.
Yeah, that's a heavy blow right there.
I don't know if people are familiar with his film body of work. I haven't seen everything, but I have seen Shame. I think one of our listeners, and they brought that up on the Smiley and Tavis broadcast. Smiley and West, sorry, I'm messing up all the way. Smiley and West, they brought it up there, his film body of work. But I have seen Shame. That would be worthy of a cowbell as well.
Yeah, it was good. That film was good. In terms of studying white supremacy, you see how wrong it is for, like, I mean, I remember there was a scene in there where the main character was sleeping with a black girl from his job, and then you could see the awkwardness. You could just feel from watching it how like why interracial relationships is not a good idea. You could tell. I got that from that film. I got that sense from it. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Mhm. Well, that's a cognitive dissonance, because here it is, you putting out all of this good work, but yet still you're going home and sleeping with a racist suspect. It's like Pam says, it's like you're cleaning your computer hard drive, but then you're going back and you're reinfecting it again with that virus every day. So,
yeah, I can. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I just want to chime in on the fact that I think that this would be a terrible book to introduce into the classrooms, because one of our obstacles is the Christian ethic, and I don't think we're realizing just how much of that is in the book, how much of judge not lest ye be judged, vengeance, is mine, saith the Lord. There's a lot of that in this book, and it is an obstacle in addressing racism, white supremacy. But I was just looking at the context of this. This woman, Derby, had 4 sons, and all of them had publishing houses on both hemispheres, and she says to her sons, a mother's advice to children, I wish that my 4 sons, as apostles of light in a partly Christianized America, might improve and exalt the moral faculties and unsubdued hearts of this intelligent but inconsistent people. And as I was reading, I just said, there's too much of the Christian ethic in this to do us any long-term good. And I just don't think that we're appreciating that so far in the book.
Could it be that it's the wrong? Could it be that it's the wrong Christian ethics that's in the book? Because I feel that Christianity it's been bastardized, and I mean, Nat Turner used Christianity to do slave rebellions. So I mean, you could use it in a way that could benefit you. I just think that the way white people used it, they used it the wrong way. They taught the slave the wrong kinds of Christianity in order to keep them into bondage. So I don't think Christianity is a hindrance. I think it could be a benefit.
It could be.
I don't know everything. But go ahead.
I have never been taught the part of the Bible that would benefit us in getting rid of racism and white supremacy, and I don't hear it preached in the pulpits when I go to church, and I just don't see how we would have access to another form of Christianity that would benefit us.
Exactly. Because all of these preachers, they come from a certain script, and they're all taught a certain way, in order to anesthetize the masses. It's to keep you in this calm, sedated way. It's not to rile you up. And you're not going to get that liberation. They always say liberation theology, but there is nothing liberating that they're going to teach you, because everything in this book is saying that Jesus died for all our sins and everything is forgiven, and we just need to move on, put it in the past, and all of this nonsense. So no. I don't see nothing redeeming.
But then Christianity, the whole Christian religion, doesn't that originate from Africa? I mean,
I'm going to hop in here because we're kind of at the end of the program, and we have deviated from the book with the dollar. I would say on just with the point that you brought up about whether or not Christianity can be used, whether it's helpful and all that, I would say just in the context of this book, we'll have to pay attention. But I don't think Nat Turner is brought up in this book, which is kind of fascinating because this is like within 20 years of the Nat Turner revolt, when this book, or at least the time frame, if we're going 1840s to early 1850s, you're 20, 30 years removed from Nat Turner, and that had such a big impact. I don't think that gets brought up at all. And he did. I mean, it was Minister Nat Turner. For that to be omitted is kind of major, particularly you're going through the Virginia area and no talk of that at all. That's kind of interesting. I could be wrong. We'll keep an eye out to see if it does come up, but I don't think it does. That would kind of, in my opinion, that would be leaning towards, if this is taught in classrooms and it's generally going to be a white woman who's up there teaching, I don't think they're going to be getting this in the spirit of Minister Nat Turner's Christianity. They're going to be getting this in the spirit of Uncle Tom type Christian, because that's at the beginning of the book, Uncle Tom. And forgive those who trespassed against us, and, you know, hey, we will ask God for forgiveness, and that's because I mean that's what we've got in the first 5 chapters anyway. I haven't heard with the mutiny. I didn't hear we're going to pray to God to help us to kill as many of these whites as possible, even old Salem. I didn't hear that. Maybe there is counter-violence coming. I will say that counter-violence is on the way. That is going to come up, so we can stay tuned. But I just I could see how white people in a white-dominated, racist classroom, they would have a field day with this textbook. They would have an absolute field day, and I can see if we're talking teenage victims of racism, getting this book in a classroom setting with a lot of white people and or white teacher, even if it was all non-white people, but a white teacher, oh man, this could be kryptonite. This could be poison with regards to understanding racism, white supremacy. I could see them having a field day with this book and how it's presented for a lot of the reasons that I named earlier. But we are only...
Can I say one more comment?
Yes, sir. One more thing? Last comment. Go ahead.
From that Smiley and West radio show, Steve McQueen stated that it was his wife that put him on to this book. Like, he was annoyed. Wow.
That's
fascinating. He was annoyed at the fact that he didn't read it, you know, but his wife put him on to it. It's just fascinating.
That white female strikes again. As I said, the most dangerous of them all.
Right. I am not so. I actually did hear that part. I didn't hear the whole thing. He did about, I think, 30 minutes worth of dialoguing with them on the program. You can download it or listen to it online, the Smiley and West program. If you don't want to listen to the whole thing, you'll have an opportunity to hear a clip from it, because I am going to use some of it as an intro for one of the programs we do. It might not be next week, but it is coming. But I am not surprised. I think in one of our earlier book sessions, we had one of our listeners say that a white woman informed him about a book that he thought was very constructive and revealed a lot about racism, white supremacy. I've even had that in my experience, where it was a white woman said, oh, you should check out Medical Apartheid, Harriet Washington, white woman. You should check out Amiri Baraka and his film... They're on a train. I can't even think of the name of it. They're on a train. It's Amiri Baraka. The Dutchman. That's it. The Dutchman. It's a screenplay, and it's a film, so you can watch it or you can read it. But she said, check that out. It's been my experience. White women, they are not ignorant about racism, white supremacy. White people in general are not ignorant.
If anyone is ignorant about racism,
It's black people.
Worldwide, that has been my experience. But we will be back with this book next Friday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. It will not take us very long. I think there will be max 5 of these sessions, max, I'm thinking. So we will be done, I'm thinking max the first Friday in December. So you all can be thinking of books that you would like to do next. But as people see the film, as we're reading the book, make notes, comparison, contrast. I would be on the lookout for some of the major themes we talked about already, how religion factors into the book, good white people that are not racist, and how color is used in the film and the book. I had some passages that I highlighted as well that I didn't read, were just the use of the term fair has been used a lot in this book already, and just the use of color I think is very interesting. Those are some of the main themes I would pay attention to. I think we already got the authenticity of this book. Do we think white people tampered with it and what have you? And also why white people are focusing so much attention on this film. The book. I think those would be some major points to keep in mind if you go see the film, or if you're hearing dialogues, other programs, or even if you're in Minneapolis or other areas where Mr. McQueen might pop up. If he does a Q&A in your area, has some questions ready to roll, even about his racist suspect spouse. But we'll be back tomorrow for the compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, and Sunday as well. Professor Carolyn Wilkins, she also has a child with a white parent. She married a white man. They thankfully got divorced, but she'll be with us on Sunday, and she has quite a bit to say about how that impacted her views on racism, white supremacy. Should be interesting to hear from her Sunday evening, same program time, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Anyone want to do the prayer before we wrap things up?
I would do it.
Right on. Invest if you think the program is constructive. Louis Gossett Jr. also did reading of this audiobook. There are multiple versions of it. I think this is a black male. I actually checked while we were listening to the progress. I think this is a black male who's reading the version that we have, but Louis Gossett Jr. also did a version. So if you want to check and hear his rendition, see how it measures up, you can do that as well. Invest if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. PayPal is in the top right corner. And we will be back tomorrow, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, compensatory call-in. Caller, take it away.
To the Creator, we ask that you help us and guide us and show us the truth about what it means to be a white person. Help us to combat the system and help us to realize that we do have power to overcome this system and replace it with a system of justice. We just have to understand what it means to be a white person and what we have to do in response to that. Ashe.
Ashe. Context of White Supremacy, signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
I'm a victim, brother.
You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my condition. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.